I've got you.
You've got me. Who's got you?
What's up, everybody? Today we are talking about hope, Lois Lane, and terrible physics. That's right, we are talking about Superman. Get your gifts in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe and follow and share if we provide any kind of value. Enjoy the show. Hello, everybody, and welcome to One Brilliant Arcs. Let's talk stories. We have another special guest today. That we have Brian. Do you want me to say your full name? It says your full name right there. So, I mean, I guess anybody's.
I was about to say you can say my first name, my last name, both, whatever you want to go by.
All right, we have Brian Henderson here, who's a friend of Charles and now a friend of One Brilliant Arc. So we welcome here today. He wanted to be here to discuss what we are talking about today, and our one of our editors has the right idea. English has the right
it's overrated.
idea. We are talking about Superman today. Superman 1, I believe it's the 1978 78 version of the film, and we are going to be doing a whole thing. And now we're not gonna do it in order, in the sense of for the next few weeks it's all gonna be Superman, as much as we'd like that, but we will be throughout this season, if you will, doing Superman movies throughout. So Superman 1978 all the way to Man of Steel.
Can't wait for the quest for peace.
The one that shall not be named. So we will do that. We will talk about that. Last week we talked about, our last episode, I should say, we talked about, what did we talk about? I want to say it wasn't Twilight. It was Hadestown is what we talked about last episode. And that ended up being a, not so much here's some story mechanics, more of a, like, here is how to be a better writer, off the page type of episode. And I kind of feel like that's what's going to happen today's episode as well, just because when I personally get to talking about Superman, I lose all sense of lessons. So, that's just probably going to happen. But yeah, so we're going to talk about some Superman today. But before we jump into that, I want to talk about, we have our hosts here, our normal hosts. We have Jaylon and we have Charles, who is,
Sorry there. I didn't know.
In his comic book.
I was just reading the first Superman comic book that I got back in California. That's how old it is. Superman Shadows Linger by Kurt Busiek. I don't know if I can pronounce that. And Peter Vale, Jesus Merino, and Renato Guedes. I'm probably mispronouncing that correctly. It's my first Superman comic book, everyone.
Everybody acknowledge.
I'm doing a bit, Jared. You were going for so long.
I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were going to do a thing. I just didn't know that you were going to, like, Mr. Rogers us and.
No,
and
I was trying to do the funny or die John Goodman as Colonel Sanders. And there's this thing he does where he goes, I'm sorry, I was just listening to my favorite Bette Midler album, Thousand Whispers, and it is the funniest thing. So I was trying.
I'm so glad someone quoted the KFC with John Goodman from Funny or Die. I'm glad someone else watched that masterpiece.
Be right there, O'Marion.
It's all the Planet one with Don Cheadle.
Oh my god, yeah, that is hilarious. I've seen that one. That one's hilarious. Okay, so before we do what we normally do, which is the jumping into things, we go off of what has everyone been enjoying this past week. What have you been watching? What have you been listening to? What have you been reading? Whatever. Share one thing that you want the audience to know you've been getting up to. What kind of mischief have you guys been getting up to this past week? And we're going to start with our guest first. What's one thing that you've been watching, reading, or listening to, or playing, for that matter, that's been that's have you pumped this past week?
That's a tough one, because I have been spending this last week catching up on a lot of my 2024 movies because I didn't get to watch a lot. So I've been catching up on a lot of those. Let's see, put thought process into it. Let's see.
You mean
How about
I
this?
only have
Did
to
you-
choose one?
I have not yet. That's my next one on the docket. See, the thing is right now, unfortunately, because of, dealing with things and the start of the new year, my funds are on a limited budget right now, so that means that I'm finding what's free and what comes like real easy on like streaming services right now because I would like George Miller to get some money for Furiosa if he put effort into that, especially if it's as good as I've heard it is. So I would wait until it comes on a streaming service so he at least gets some money for my watch rather than, movie.com. I guess I rewatched I'm trying to think here. There's a couple. I've been playing Diablo 4 a lot lately and really digging that. But if I'm going with something that I watched that was really good that I just like people to know about, it would probably be
We need to circle back to you, Brian.
I was gonna say you have
We
to save
definitely-
another one for if we do recommendations at the end, because you do have to
keep
save
that in
something
mind
for
too. We
that.
do a recommendation at the end, so just think about that. For that. So we're gonna circle. We'll come back.
Circle back to
Charles,
me
what
on that
about
one
you?
because my brain is like I've watched so many good things this past week and I don't know what.
I am the master of putting people on the spot, just so you know. So there you go. All right, Charles, you're up.
So this weekend, I decided I needed to rewatch Indiana Jones: The Dial of Destiny because I was gonna write an article for Oba. I was gonna say let's talk about this and why it doesn't really work for me and what we can do, because I had all these thoughts. So I was like, okay, and I saw on opening day the first showing in the most uncomfortable scene imaginable. Like I'm not kidding. It was like the neck and my back were dying, and it's a really long movie, and so I didn't want to. I was like, I wasn't mad at it, but I was always disappointed. I was, and I rewatched it, and it was actually pretty good. I actually really enjoyed it. It still has a lot of things I don't like in it, but I was like, oh, this actually kind of hits. So I was really happy with that. I was like, oh, it got me feeling all emotional. So that was a wonderful. I love being wrong in that sense with film, where I come at it and then I come back at it and I go, oh wait. But I did finish specifically Robert E. Howard short story, Pigeons from Hell, which I thought the ending was okay. It was published in 1938, so it's not the most, you just kind of hear something. It's like the one Key and Peele skit with the funeral for the grandpa, and the guy stands up and goes, oh, hell nah. Certain things like that. But the first part, I tried listening to this while I was sleeping in the dark, and it scared the crud out of me. So I was like, nope, I'll listen to this in the daytime. Terrifying. It's amazing. Like, honestly, I'm amazed. This is so dumb, but I'm amazed what words can do, man, on a page, or people listening on audio, just like what words can do, not pictures, just words. It's insane, bro, truly. So that's what I've been reading, watching this week. That's different from my never-ending list of stuff I can never finish.
I saw your message about Indiana Jones. It made me want to rewatch it just to rethink about it and see what I missed something on the watch, and like maybe it'll be better the second time. Because I did not like it the first time either.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is if you go at it knowing it's not the best thing in the world and knowing what they do, it actually kind of worked a little better. The villain was not good, but that's, of course, they wasted Mads Mikkelsen. Oh, never mind. Moving on. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. So maybe you will be too.
What about you, Jaylon?
I actually took Jared's suggestion this week, and my husband and I have been way excited about binging Vox Machina, The Legend of Vox Machina on Amazon. Yeah, we have been up to shenanigans vicariously through the characters of that show. I will admit it is hilarious. I love how spunky it is. I love the characters, and it's easy to fall in love with the flawed characters, which I think is really great.
That's a good one. I love Vox Machina. That's me and my wife just watched that a couple weeks ago in its entirety, 1 through 3, and I raffled quite a bit during that show.
Yeah, Jared definitely knew us very well when he pitched that recommendation.
I am on season 3 of that, so I'm not done yet. However, so that's what I was pretty much watching all weekend with my wife. But when my wife wasn't around, I found that I have been obsessed with D&D roleplay videos on YouTube. Like, insanely obsessed with them.
Hey, there's nothing wrong with that. Don't facepalm, Charles. There's some good... My wife loves watching, like, Critical Role, but, like, any kind of role-playing ones can be entertaining.
Yes, I watched Fantasy High. I've been watching Fantasy High by Dimension 20, and it is fantastic. Not only that, I am doing my first ever D&D playthrough this Friday with a group that I found. I've never played it before. My filmmaking mentor has told me that I needed to play D&D at least once. He told me that it would make me a better director if I was a dungeon master at some point, so I should consider it. And I was always like, I'm not that guy. I don't like that stuff. I have problems with Lord of the Rings. I have a problem with high fantasy stuff. It just doesn't sit well with me. And then I saw it and I was like, shit, I like this. I can see myself participating in this type of activity, these types of shenanigans. And yeah, it's been really, really fun to watch. I think what really trips me out is the fact that I spent majority of the weekend watching it like I would watch a TV show on like Netflix. And it was just a bunch of people sitting around a table talking and acting it out and rolling dice. And the fact that that was enough to entertain me and have me like gasping and like going to get, pausing it to go get my food so I can come back and watch it was like, it aligns well with what Charles is saying about how words can really the words can really get you. This is, like I said, there was no action. They did have like little figurines and miniatures and stuff like that, but I've seen other ones where they don't have that. Like I was supposed to be working today and I wasn't. I spent the entire day watching Vampire the Masquerade RP that somebody was doing, and it was just them talking. Like it looked like this, and they were just doing that. And I was just like, this is awesome. I could do this all day. I could watch this all day. I did watch that all day. And I will probably watch it when I'm done here after this. But yeah, that's what I've enjoyed. I will let you guys know probably by the next recording how the D&D thing goes. I don't know any of these people, so that I'm super social anxiety person. New social circumstances freak me the hell out. So this is going to be really, really weird. But I'm actually pretty excited about it. I've been working on my character. I'm just like, I'm pumped to do this. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. So yeah, that's me. That's been great. So yeah, whatever. Back to Brian.
On that, you're going to have a lot of fun with D&D because I echo the sentiments of your film mentor there in saying that DMing, me and a buddy of mine decided to try DMing last year because I've been playing D&D for a long time. And it has helped me a lot with story planning and figuring out, because Charles has always been, when we've done work together, he plans things out pretty meticulously. And that's not something that I've been very good at. But D&D taught me a lot of planning it out meticulously to the point I have an almost document the size of Charles's for his stuff he works on. Sometimes it's pretty huge, like 20 pages just laying out like this is the plot where I'm gonna go from here and here, and obviously things will change based off of people's reactions, but like the overall story I'll figure out how to get here. And it also helps you with like figuring things out on the fly because you have like a second to it's not life or death obviously, but like you have a few seconds to figure out, or else you don't want to bring down the momentum. So you're like, how am I going to do this? What am I going to do? I'm going to, I pull out my, do this and launch magic missile. I do this, or I sit there and I just decide to do this thing. And sometimes that kind of stuff can help me a lot, at least storytelling wise, on like figuring out how to both work on the fly, but also plan better and get stuff laid out. Just wanted to comment on that when you had said that. Also, I did figure out my 2 things that I wanted to recommend.
Okay. Save your recommendation for the end, but what is the one thing that you watched this week that you want to share?
Well, I would like to share that I watched a movie for the second time from last year that I feel is pretty underrated, and after watching it the second time, I feel people should really watch it. It was called Saturday Night. It's about the first episode of Saturday Night Live in 1975. And I think a lot of people watched it and thought it was going to be like a true life documentary about or like a true life like film, like, like most of them like, let's cover this moment in time. But it was really like this 90 minutes of like interesting, both comic but also anxiety, like how much of a disaster that was, where it kind of fascinated me because it was very interesting. Like it took more like it's a masterpiece how that turned out as good as it did. How that first episode of Saturday Night Live turned out as good as it did, because there's like infighting between everyone. It was just a fascinating watch because it wasn't what I expected. And I think it was one of the more underrated movies that came out last year that a lot of people didn't talk about because I think people thought it was going to be something different than what it really turned out to be.
I completely agree with that. That movie is fantastic. That's the movie I was talking about, Jaylon, when I was talking about my whole Titanic remake.
Yep, thing. I was going to say, this sounds familiar. I feel like we've talked about it this week.
Yes, because I wasn't pitching it, but I was throwing an idea at Jaylon that I had about doing a Titanic rewrite or a Titanic remake that focused solely on the band, and either doing the 90 minutes before the Titanic hits thing in their relationship, or doing a 2-hour and 40-minute piece of real time the ship going down, but focusing solely on the band and what they're dealing with and all of that. One way or another. I wasn't sure which one to go. What?
That's stage play.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I don't know. I don't know why. I want to do it. I don't know if I will ever do it, but I want to. It may just go into the bucket of things that I've come up with that I will never do. But it's just like nice to sit there.
I would do something with it though. I kind of like that idea because I always love approaching a historical event from not just a normal perspective of how you do it, but from like something like that. Like, oh, it's the band that stayed behind, which is a true story in the thing. Like, I'm sure they exaggerated a bit for the James Cameron movie, but that is true to the Titanic, that there was a band and they did play and they did continue playing during the disaster as it went down for a bit. I found that out and was interested by that. So
yeah, that's why I came up with it, because I found out about it too, and I was like, I mean, I remember it from the movie, but I was like, I thought that was just in the movie, but then I was like, oh no, they really did do that. These people actually died going down in the plane. I was like, that's an interesting story, and I want to kind of tell that story. Plus, I'm super obsessed with. I told Jaylon this. I'm super obsessed with the reality of like life, and this is not to be morbid before we jump into Superman. But I'm gonna be morbid before we jump into Superman.
It's okay.
But I'm super obsessed with like the reality of like in life, every moment that you live could be like an hour from now, any one of us could be dead. So like that period of time, and none of us know it, that kind of thing. And so when you make a movie or tell a story about a character from history, X amount of minutes or X amount of hours before they die, I always find those stories to be super interesting, because it's always like, oh, like the things that they were planning, the things that they thought when they thought they had more time, and how interesting that really is. It's really fun. So yeah. But anyway, this is not a Hollywood pitch. We'll talk about that some other time. Let's talk about Superman. Everybody now I'm glad that Brian got to be here for this. I know Jaylon's sister's boyfriend
yes,
wanted to be here too, because he wanted to talk about it. So I've promised the Superman 2 appearance to him. Nobody that knows me likes Superman, so besides you guys. So everybody else I know is like Batman, and I'm like, get away from me.
Well, I like Batman too, but Superman?
No.
How do you not like Superman?
I don't know, but they're psychotic. It's okay. But anyway, if you know anything about me, though, Charles, you know me very well, and you know how much I love Superman. So freaking much, I would have worn my Superman shirt, but it was stolen from me. Price of being married. So I no longer.
Your man right here.
So I no longer have it in my possession. Either one of them, actually. They've both been stolen from me. I had one. My wife stole it, and then so I bought another one. and that one was also stolen. So now I've just given up on it, and it's, I'm not meant to have nice things, I guess. It's fine. But we're gonna talk about Superman 1978 version, Christopher Reeves. Reeve.
George Reeves.
Christopher Reeve. Excuse me.
Christopher Reeve.
Yeah. Gosh, get it right.
My bad. Listen, Christopher Reeve is arguably, to many people, the greatest Superman to play the character on screen. I highly disagree, and that's okay. We're allowed to disagree here. I think he is the greatest Clark Kent to play Clark Kent on screen, but no, I will not say Superman. That being said, first I would like to go around the room, or the several rooms that we're in, and talk about and ask you guys, before I go into mine, what is your earliest memory of Superman? Now, Jaylon, we all know, or most of us know, that your earliest memory is Friday, but
Yes.
Everyone else...
Oh, no.
I was going to say,
Everyone
I will
else.
go last, because I feel like I'm going to have the least interesting answer.
So I will start with Charles. Let's start with you. What's your earliest memory or earliest introduction to Superman?
Here, Brian, this will be a test for you because Brian's a composer, everyone. Homeboy actually had a piece of his own music play for his wedding's dance, which I'm standing on the side at the wedding. I'm like, that's baller. So
very nice.
What can I say? That was my wife's request, by the way, not mine, to put my own music in my own wedding. Continue, Charles.
But here, this is my first one is what is that?
That's you tested me or you tested Brian?
Brian. Music.
Oh, okay.
Music.
I couldn't hear you very well. Repeat it. Old man moment. I'm trying to figure out. Definitely sounds like John Williams.
No, Shirley Walker.
Shirley Walker.
Yeah.
You're doing the Superman TV series, right?
Yeah. The cartoon.
Shirley Walker.
That, Jared? Yeah. So
okay, got it. Because she did the Batman the animated series and the TV show, and underrated composer for anybody. Absolutely great.
Yes, she's amazing.
May she rest in peace.
Yeah, that was my first introduction to Superman was the 90s cartoon, and it was just, there's something about the art style and the music and, the cape, the hair, the boots, the whole thing just stuck in my head, and that was the first one. And a lot of my Superman-ness actually starts with the whole DC animated universe of that, Justice League Unlimited, all that jazz. And it was when I was a teenager that started to get much more obsessive. But me and Jared have talked about this in our Man of Steel podcast. So for those who don't know, here's a plug. There you go. But that's my earliest memory.
What about you, Brian?
Well, for me, I watched it much later. I know a lot of people watched it when they were really young. And my father was a big, he wasn't a huge superhero. He was so he never really, it wasn't until I was in my young teens when I watched that movie. But I remember vividly watching the 78 one and being fascinated by both. I liked the hope of it all. It was fun. I enjoyed it, especially because that was around the time, it was years past, but that was when we were starting to get into, I think that was around the time Dark Knight Rises came out. So we were, really in the dark, edgy superhero mode, but, during the good period of that, in my opinion, before it started to get too good, dark and edgy. But I enjoyed the hope of it, and I also, as Charles mentioned, I do a lot with, I'm not just a composer, but I do a lot with film music, and the score for Superman, let's be honest here, John Williams' theme is one of the most iconic theme songs ever and has fully influenced superhero music for ever. Almost every superhero theme down to the Marvel movies that do now, even if you can't remember them, have that in the DNA. I remember the music sticking out to me. I remember finding out that Richard Donner, the director, also did The Goonies and a few other, had a big part in a lot of those movies, and was oh, my childhood. Huh, fascinating. My childhood was directed by this man. And then also, once again, I liked the hope feel of it all. So I don't have a specific memory tied to it. It's just a time period of like I said, it was a lot of dark movies. And that was a very hopeful, very energetic. I love Gene Hackman as an actor, and watching him like chew up the scenery as Lex Luthor, even if people argue that he overhams it, I still enjoy watching him ham up the screen. Christopher Reeve, while I agree with you, is probably not my personal favorite Superman, is an excellent Superman
For
nonetheless.
sure.
As well
For
as
sure.
an excellent, like if there was like a runner up next up, Christopher Reeve would be instantly in that group for me. But I just like the hope and feel of that, and it stuck to me at the time.
Really quick, to misunderstand your question, Jared, did you mean Superman as a concept or this movie?
Either one. I mean, if you guys want to share your first introduction to the movie, that's fine. If you want to share your first introduction to Superman in general, that's also fine.
I thought it was the movie, but that was about the same for me, because that was before Man of Steel and all of that came out. So Superman, the original movie, and the TV show were my two introductions to Superman.
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
My only adage to that is basically, I just want to jump on what Brian said, is basically around the time when I was in high school, I was like, Superman was part of DC Comics and the cartoons, so of course I was a fan, I liked him, and I'd seen Superman Returns, and it was fine, that's a story for another day, and it was fine, but I never seen this movie, and then I watched it when I was in high school, early high school, and it hit me just right. I've told you the story, Jared, where this movie changed my life in terms of I'm like, that's who I want to be. That kind of spirit and belief and what I want to give the world, that's what I want. And so it's hugely influenced me in general, because I find this movies, we'll get into it, the tone, the texture really hit. But in terms of this, the whole opening, 5-10 minutes of this movie is it brings me to tears. It's so beautiful. But that's my experience. Sorry, I misheard the question.
No, you're all good.
I have to get it right. But Jaylon, yeah, I want to hear this.
Well, I
Tell us
will
about
say,
last Friday.
I will say that as someone who grew up under a rock, I was the oldest child in my family. There were no other males around until I was 9 years old. My parents weren't very into superheroes either. That wasn't their culture growing up that they wanted to share with me. So I never really got into superheroes, but I still knew about Superman because of how prevalent that character was in just everyday life, just in the culture. So my first experience with Superman, I couldn't tell you because I can't remember a time that I didn't know who that character was. Last Friday, when I watched the movie for the first time, because I knew that we were going to record this episode, I had been hearing about it from Jared and Charles, and I was getting really excited, thinking that this was going to be a really awesome movie. And I'm going to make an admission that I'm actually scared to make, because you all are going to crucify me. I'm going to be the party pooper to this episode like Jared was to Twilight. I don't want to say that I hated the movie, because I feel like you all are going to change my opinion based on all the gold nuggets that you share about it here. But I will say that I was disappointed and frustrated because I wanted it to be better than it was.
Okay.
I
So
kind
that's
of
what I'll say for now.
You are not unwrong.
I will
in
even go.
an interesting way.
I will go as far as saying that I do not disagree with you, because I watched it again this past weekend for the first time in a long time, and watched it with my wife. And my wife has this personality where she has a tendency to try to be super optimistic about every single thing. And when it comes to a movie, so even when I watch movies very analytically, very critically, and I will call out everything that's wrong with it, just because it's just and so when I was watching it, I was like, oh, I loved this. Why? That was stupid. That makes no sense. Why did that happen? And my wife was just coming up with an excuse for every little thing. And I was like, I recognize why I loved it. And so to get into that, though, I will give you my experience with Superman. So there are several different entry points to my experiences with Superman. My first entry point is, I'm going to set the scene for you because it's a big deal. Picture a Sunday night in the 90s. Let's say, I want to say maybe 95, 96.
My birth year, 95.
So most of you guys were either not alive yet or or were like the tail, you were just born. So you may not be able to grasp what I'm saying, but most of you guys know you know the 90s, you know all that. This was a Sunday evening, 1995, I want to say. I had the gooeyest slice of Pizza Hut pizza a person could have. I walked into the living room, and on our cable television, this square analog box on, I want to say it was ABC, but I could be wrong. But the first thing that I saw was these bank robbers who were robbing a bank, and they were getting away, and then all of a sudden this huge S flew in front of the screen, and the bullets were bouncing off of his chest. And I stood there, cheese dripping off my pizza on the floor, transfixed on the screen. No idea who this individual was. Then they reveal his face. At the time, this was the greatest person I had ever seen in my life. This was Dean Cain, Superman. Adventures of Lois and Clark, Adventures of Superman. First time I had ever seen it. No idea who this person was, no idea why they existed, but I knew that I wanted to see more of them. Didn't see more of them for a really long time, oddly enough. In my household, Superman was lumped into the category of witches and magic and things of that nature, which is, the irony in that is hilarious to me. But at the time, I did not know that, so I was forbidden to watch that. But I turned 12 and got my I turned 14 and was able to watch my girlfriend at the time had suggested that I watch the show because there was this really, really hot guy on it that she apparently thought that I needed to be. And I was like, I'm black, so that's not going to work, but whatever. And so this young man happened to be Tom Welling, who is Clark Kent in the show Smallville.
Oh.
And so I watched that. And from the very first episode, I was locked on. I went through high school watching Smallville. And all the times where I was bullied and I was told that I was too white to be black or I was too black to be white, Clark Kent reminded me that being an outsider was a cool thing and to keep showing up and keep treating people with kindness, regardless of how they treat you. And he helped me get through my graduation. On my graduation day, I got the first Superman comic book I ever got, and that was Superman All-Star, the first issue. And I was about to cry. My bad. It was the greatest day of my life. I read that comic book 45 times in one weekend. I was just obsessed with Superman. And that was, I had not even seen Christopher Reeve film yet. I saw the Christopher Reeve film for the first time, I believe. Actually, you know what? I did see it when I was younger, but I didn't know that's what it was. So it didn't resonate. So the first time that I saw it and I was able to actually resonate with it, I had already seen Smallville. I had already seen all those other things. And when I watched the Christopher Reeve version, I remember being so... I remember seeing that, and I didn't watch it on DVD. I saw it in an old theater where they played it, old movies, and I saw it for the first time, and I heard that come over the speaker, and I was just like, this is my guy. This is my guy until the day that I die. I am going to love this dude. And it went on like that forever. I hated Superman Returns for a lot of reasons. Mostly because I was super obsessed with Smallville at the time, and so the contrast between Smallville and Superman Returns just felt weird to me. So, I've had a relationship with Superman for a very, very long time. He has been a person that I wrote it in a post once that he was a father to me when I didn't have a father around. He was an example to me of what it meant to be hopeful, like Brian was talking about, but to also be your best self in a world where it is so much easier to be bad. And when people would come to me and they're, oh, I love Batman more. I love Batman more than Superman. And I'd always say, like, I get why people like Batman more than Superman. I get that he seems cooler, that he we can all be Batman if we wanted to. If you had the money and you had the training, you could go out and be Batman effectively. But I think the interesting thing that's often overlooked about Superman is we can all be Superman with or without the money. We don't need to have superpowers to be Superman. What makes Superman Superman is not his superpowers. What makes Superman Superman is his compassion, his empathy, and his desire to create a better world that proves to him daily that it shouldn't exist, honestly. And so, yeah, I have been in love with Superman forever. And so, yes, this particular movie, in my opinion, has never been Superman's greatest outing. My favorite Superman movie of all time is Superman 2. That's my favorite. I love that movie more than any of them. And so, of course, we'll have that episode. And my favorite on-screen Superman ever is Tyler, however you say his name, Tyler Hoechlin or whatever, from Superman and Lois. The guy from Teen Wolf.
Yeah,
and
Tyler Hoechlin?
Hoechlin, whatever. Him. He, in my opinion, is the best Superman to ever play Superman on screen.
Yeah, wasn't he the one in Supergirl or something, and then they picked him up
and then he did his own show, and that's probably
Superman and Lois, yeah.
Yeah, and that's probably the best Superman show, Superman outing, period, live action. Though I do like Cavill. I am a Cavalier.
I think Cavill was an excellent actor that just and a good Superman that got screwed over by a movie and a script that I don't think fully understood what makes Superman, to me at least, entertaining.
I have very strong thoughts. We've had that conversation. Me and Charles I have very strong thoughts about why I think the Man of Steel worked for what it was and what it could have been. I think that if it was allowed to go on and do more, I think it would have ultimately become. I just don't think it was given the opportunity to do that. And that's fine. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about today. If you want to hear our Man of Steel thoughts, we will be watching that again. And that's more of a threat to Charles than anyone else. I'm just kidding.
Come on.
No. I don't have to love it, and I don't have to hate it. And the fact that everyone goes, I'm like, I don't care. I didn't have emotion in the theater opening weekend. I didn't have emotion rewatching it. I don't care. And I have enough Superman comic books.
Sentence for a movie, though, if you don't care.
Precisely.
That's the death sentence of any movie, to be like, I don't hate it, or I don't love it. I just...
Indifference is it's a death sentence for any creative project.
Yes.
Yep.
So,
but Harry Potter and the Cursed Child exists, so keep that in mind. Moving on.
God.
Harry Potter exists. That's all you had to say.
I second that. I'm glad someone else said it.
I tried so hard to appreciate the Harry Potter movies. I could not.
They're fun.
Ladies and gentlemen, that will be another thing we will have to watch.
No.
A plague on all your houses. A plague on all your houses.
Look, I can't speak for them, but I don't think it's bad. I just think it's overrated. I know that's a commonly used word, but
I rather watch
genuinely
Twilight.
think it's overrated. Like, Harry Potter is fun.
No.
But it's not great. It's not as good as you remember it when you're a child.
I rather watch Twilight back to back. I rather watch Twilight back to back for eternity than watch Harry Potter.
Dude, somewhere Robert Pattinson is crying his eyes out because you just insulted both of his opening franchises.
I will agree with you. I will take Lord of the Rings over Harry Potter any day.
I would as well.
I can agree on that.
I won't say that about Lord of the Rings, that I would rather watch Twilight, because I did enjoy Lord of the Rings enough to say that I would watch it, but Harry Potter, no. That would be my hell.
So we're all Potterheads here, right?
Charles is like, you uncultured swines.
I watched.
Look at his face. He's so disgusted.
Dude, his face has stayed the same the whole time we're talking. I was wondering if his camera froze or he was just that pissed off.
It's like, it's one of those things where it's like somebody's face can say so many different things without changing an expression at all. I was just like, I'm saying all of the wrong things in this moment.
This episode is devolving into how can we say the most controversial topic?
Two things.
Hot takes. Let's go, guys.
Two things. One, I love Superman. I love Batman. I love Lord of the Rings, and I love Harry Potter. And Twilight is, as we discussed, a campy delight for me. So I just have a huge heart to love all these things.
That's true.
So
That just makes
I don't
you
want
a better
to. I'm going to do that. Second of all, the audience is
it.
basically like freaking Millhouse. When are they going to get to the fireworks factory? So enough with the Harry Potter plague on all your houses.
All
Anyway,
right, we'll move. Fair enough. We're moving along.
I didn't even know this about you, Brian. Oh my gosh, I regret everything.
We are moving along. Let's talk about the hero's journey. So, for our listeners, writers, most of our listeners are writers, and most of you are familiar with the hero's journey, specifically Joseph Campbell's The Monomyth, the art of the circle. There's so many different names for it, honestly, and a bunch of different people have called it a bunch of different things, but it all, generally speaking, is the same. But in my opinion, it's always been the blueprint for the superhero origin story. And I wonder, do you guys feel that this film does it still hold up as a gold standard for origin stories? Or do you feel that it stands up as an origin story golden standard?
Yeah, perfection. It's amazing. Though I will say, I think the first Spider-Man movie, in terms of that, I think is a stronger film in terms of the origin of being like, this is the origin story as a whole, versus this, the third act is messy, which we'll get to. But yeah, it's perfection. I adore this. And something important, so Jaylon, something kind of cool here, if you don't know, is that, at least as far as it was always told to me, was Superman, Clark Kal-El is thrown off into space and he just happens on Earth, right? This is the movie that invented Jor-El knows about Earth, and he's saying, let's see if I can make the child, the last son of Krypton, actually mean something. So the whole be a light to show the way, at least as far as it was told to me, this movie invented that, and that wasn't part of the origin, which I think is brilliant, because basically this is a perfect adaptation of Superman's origin and has the myth and the romantic fairy tale-ness and all that jazz. But it's not, it doesn't do all of that, these comic G. Willikers-ness. So in this, and there is G. Willikers-ness in this movie, but like, for example, Clark wondering, what is he supposed to do as a teenager? All that. I love this dad. It's like, you're not just here to play football, right? That's, as far as I've known Superman, came from this movie. So I think, it's a brilliant gold standard of origin, but I think it's also really good because they didn't just go A to B. They looked at it and said, how can we plus it? And an idea that Clark was in the Fortress of Solitude training for all that time, and he has to go. So his dad doesn't die. I want to make this clear to everyone. Clark's father, Jonathan Kent, does not die all the time. I have in my closet right now a back issue of him being alive in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So shush, everyone. He doesn't die.
Because I hated that he died. Yeah. I absolutely, as soon as that scene happened, I wrote off the rest of the movie. I said, that's it. And then Superman told his mom that he had to leave right after his dad died. I was like, so you're just going to leave her? And then after that, I was checked out. I was just mad at that point. I was like, your timing sucks.
But his death, though, has that brilliant idea about he can't do everything. And that always weighs on him. And I think that's I think that comes from this movie. So I think, and the Spider-Man movie did this really well too. In fact, actually, I think the Spider-Man movie is my favorite version of that whole origin in general. But I think it's brilliant in terms of writing that they adapted it perfectly, but they also did different stuff to it because they could make it a little bit more exciting. So then it's fascinating how this kind of continues, because in Smallville, they did Martha Kent have a miscarriage? Because I'm not super familiar with Smallville. Okay, so I think it was Smallville, and I could be wrong, that invented the idea that let's make the Kents, 30 years old, proper age of freaking old school. Martha and Jonathan Kent are like with walkers here. But from that with Smallville, they had this idea that one of the reasons that the Kents suffered a miscarriage. And then they find Kal-El, baby Kal-El. And so it's interesting of how it continues forward in terms of trying new things. I think this movie started that. And I think that's a brilliant thing. But yeah, gold standard. I have a lot of praises for this movie, but I do understand, Gianna, where you're coming from on the movie.
I'm so sorry.
Even though you're wrong.
It's okay.
You're wrong
I
about
can
Harry
be wrong.
Potter too.
That's okay. I can be wrong.
It's impossible to be wrong about films, whether they're good or bad, because they're subjective. So technically, I feel like it's impossible to be wrong.
You're being very gracious with me.
Yeah, but it's true though, because I've come to the conclusion that you can. There are some films that I do think are objectively bad, and I think we all know are just objectively bad. Overall, I think that because what constitutes good or bad, like I said, I think the only thing that really determines whether a movie is good or not or bad is, does the movie do what the movie set out to do? Did it make you, at least for me, did the movie make you feel what it set out to make you feel? If it did that, then it's fair to say it's a
Yeah. It could also have something to do with how you approach, or how it makes you feel, or you approach it too. Like, even if I know in my heart that the Superman 1978 is not the greatest film of all time, but it had a little bit of an impact at a time, and a certain, not quite as much as you, Jared, obviously, but had a bit of enough of an impact that I can look past that and look past certain perceived flaws on things to admit that I find it to be a good movie, but I also understand where she's coming from about it not being a perfect movie. And I'm not going to argue and be like, oh my God, it's not, because I can see the point. I can watch it and be like, there's some flaws in here. It's not a perfect film. And there's some storytelling hiccups and a few things that could have slightly been better and have been improved upon in the years since the superhero film has stacked off of it. But it's kind of more about, like, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes into looking at what makes a film good or bad, to where I agree with you about it not necessarily being just a blanket statement of this movie is good or this movie is bad. It's a subjective opinion based off a million different factors that can make a movie good or bad or solid or not as good. Like, there's no like definitive answer for any of that. Like, you can find negative things about almost any movie at all, depending on how hard you look. Like, I was watching the movie Godfather, the original Godfather, with a friend of mine because I hadn't watched it in years. It's a very enjoyable movie. I see why it's one of the most popular and most like commonly referred to as one of the greatest films of all time. But there's also a fight scene in that movie that is awful. Like, it looks like he's punching the ground. And I'm like, okay. So even in a movie that people genuinely consider a masterpiece, there's hiccups you can see if you look for that, or if you don't look for that.
For sure.
I will say, though, that the hero's journey, at the very least, the origin story in this film was really great, because I was super emotionally drawn into the history behind this baby and why he was being yeeted out into space and what his purpose was. And I really loved those scenes.
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Charles.
He wasn't lightly sent into space. He was yeeted, downset.
Give it to Shohei Ohtani. Bam!
But yeah, I really appreciated the history behind this child, and then how he was adopted, how he was raised. I really loved, I think my favorite scene in this movie would have to be him as a teenager having that conversation with Mr. Kent, because it showed so much humanity that we can relate to, even though he wasn't human, and it made him relatable. The part that I wish that I could have seen to complete the hero's journey for me was where the transition happened, because I know we had those training scenes where he was supposedly, locked in the Fortress of Solitude.
Shot. Yeah.
Fair. It was supposed to be for 12. All you saw was a bunch of stars and a little bit of voiceover, and then there was no other character development that we got to see with Superman. So I really wish that we could have seen I wish that we could have seen him struggle like he did when he was a teenager, now as an adult, trying to complete this mission that he had. And I feel like because I missed out on that, I lost any bit of emotional attachment that I had to this character for the rest of his journey.
That makes
Makes
sense.
sense. It does.
I think I never really thought about it that way, but I think a big part of why I connected with Superman more in his origin was because my seeing Superman, the 1978 movie, happened after I'd saw a big chunk of Smallville. So for me, I was already seeing. I saw the whole show is an origin story. So it's all about. And granted, there are some major misses in that show, and it is just incredibly silly at a lot of times. But the first, I will say this, and I say this to Charles and anybody else, I always recommend to watch it. The first 4 seasons of Smallville are peak. 5 is where it gets a little bit shaky, but it pretty much sticks to landing. After that, I cannot speak for Smallville at all. I enjoy it, but I understand why a lot of people don't. And the ending, although we all know what the ending is supposed to be, we all know who he's supposed to be, it didn't feel as satisfying as I wanted it to.
Involved in the ending, I've heard.
Yes, Darkseid is involved in the end. And it isn't even that, because like they did the build up for that and the fight for that really well. That all went really well. He didn't fight Darkseid or anything, but just the whole it was more of, I spent 10 years watching the show. I want to see this dude put on the suit, go around and fly and do all the crazy shit that he does. I don't want to see him from far away as Superman, and I don't want to see him run across a rooftop and rip his shirt open and just see the S, and that's all you give me. That feels incredibly cheap and incredibly unfair. But then again, there's the legal stuff of DC, like there's only so much of this we're going to let you have. So I understand. It's still a little shitty, but I understand. But, talking about Jonathan Kent's death, and that I agree that there are definitely versions of the story where Jonathan Kent is still alive. In fact, I was not aware that Jonathan Kent died until Smallville, because keep in mind, when I saw Lois and Clark, on the Lois and Clark show, both of his parents are alive the entire time. So, and they're like a big part, not a huge part of his life, but they're a pretty big part of his life in the show. So I was always like, oh yeah, they're always a part of the thing. And then when in season 5 of Smallville, sorry for the spoilers, but it's been over since 2011. In season 5, when Jonathan Kent dies, I was devastated. I was like, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to happen. His dad's supposed to be, fat and wear glasses, and when he becomes Superman, like this is crazy. But so when I saw it in the movie, which it was really sad too, the way he dies in the movie is also it's kind of like, I mean, it's going to happen. Like if you know stories and you recognize patterns, it's going to happen. But just seeing it happen felt kind of shit. Your dad's like, he just like fell over and died right there. Like that's pretty sad. And I did feel that. I felt that whole, like, all of these powers and there's nothing I can do about it. And that's the interesting thing, is that's not the only time that's ever done in the Superman mythos of, like, Superman has all these powers, but he can't stop people from dying other than, direct intervention of, like, people falling off buildings and stuff like that. But it's very, very interesting. So I think that this was a fantastic origin story. I also agree with Charles in the sense of, I don't know if this movie is the golden standard for origin films. If I had to say the golden standard, meaning it is the pinnacle of origins, I would definitely say Spider-Man 1, Tobey Maguire, is probably the gold standard for origin films. And I think that every single superhero film that did an origin story afterwards took from that film in some way, shape, or form.
I think Superman walked so Spider-Man could run.
Agree.
That's a good description.
I also think it's kind of interesting that Brian brings up seeing The Godfather, considering the fact that Mario Puzo was the one who wrote Godfather as well as this film.
What's his name? God, Marlon Brando plays.
Yes, playing the patriarch in both series. So, I was gonna go for like a Richard Pryor thing, but there is no Richard Pryor thing to be said about Godfather. I just wanted to bring up Richard Pryor. Listen, I I cannot wait for us to watch that episode, talk about that on that episode. Brian, if you'd like to come back and talk about Superman 3 and 4, you are more than welcome to come back.
Let's go.
I think Jaylon's going to hate both of those.
I did not mind Spider-Man.
Huh?
Are you talking Spider-Man or Superman?
No, we're talking about Superman.
Superman.
Okay.
Superman 3
You
and
haven't
4.
watched Spider-Man
Keep the
either?
men together.
No, I have watched Spider-Man. I did like Spider-Man, but this is a whole nother topic, so
Yeah.
I was about to start
thought
another.
that's what you said, and I was like, what? You haven't
By the
watched
way,
Spider-Man?
I love Spider-Man because my heart is filled with love, unlike my 3 other hosts today.
Come
Moving
on, we're
on.
not that bad.
So, but Superman 3 is actually was for the longest time one of my favorite Superman movies for a really long time. Superman 3 was.
Superman 3's fun.
I only thought it because I just loved the idea of Superman versus Clark Kent or whatever, Clark Kent versus Superman. That scene was just like my favorite scene ever in a movie. And I was like really weird as a kid because like I just never could tell the difference between them. I didn't realize Superman and Lois. Clark and Lois, or Lois and Clark, whatever. I didn't realize that Dean Cain and Superman were the same person. The actor, I thought it was like the Incredible Hulk, where you had like Lou Ferrigno played the Hulk, and then you had Bill Bixby as. I always thought, oh, so there's a different guy that plays Superman, and there's a guy who plays Clark. No idea. Superman, the 1978 movie, I had no idea. I was like, that's a different guy. And then, like, as an adult, I was like, you were an idiot as a child.
The glasses worked.
It worked on me.
To that end, Jaylon, at least as far as was told to me, so the whole classic glasses thing. Fun fact, by the way, I have seen, I think it was in the Graham Norton show, Henry Cavill actually stood in the middle of Times Square with a Superman shirt and glasses, and no one recognized him. Jot that down.
I don't know how them glasses worked. I've always felt that was the same thing that Marvel did with like the I'm Captain America undercover with a ball cap and a t-shirt. It's like I'm like, does no one know what Chris Evans and Captain America looks like? Like, come on.
So
I will say this is a testament to distinguishing your characters not by description of physical traits, but distinguishing them by speech patterns and quirks, because I think that's the big thing that makes it so hard to pick out, so hard to see that Clark Kent is actually Superman. Because, I mean, you have this scene in this movie where he comes this close to telling Lois that he as Clark Kent is Superman. And he takes off his glasses, and you see him step into that Superman persona. Yeah. And for a second, it's so easy to recognize him as Superman. But then as soon as he puts those glasses back on and starts talking in the manner of Clark Kent and goes back to carrying himself as Clark Kent, it's unrecognizable again.
Very true.
To that end, when I was a kid, right, with the 90s cartoon, right, literally it's just the same model as Superman, and he's got little lines. And as a kid, I was like, does no one know? It's got the little lines. As far as was told to me, this movie, at least in my imagination, my knowing, invented that idea that Clark is bumbling and he slumps and he go, well, golly, Lois, and Superman is like this. So there was kind of, in the old radio plays, it was always like, this looks like a job for Superman. So there was kind of a voice difference. But in terms of the mannerisms, this was the first time I ever believed Clark is different than Superman. And I bring that up for writing because, like you said, you can distinguish characters based on those kinds of quirks. But also in terms of adaptation, if there's something that doesn't work, don't destroy it. See if you can make it work to your angle. So there you go. There's your tip for the day.
I think that's the defining feature to me of an actor that plays Superman is how well can they, I think to your point, how well can they determine both the performance of Clark Kent, but the Superman persona, because the glasses part is like, to your point, it's pretty easy to recognize, but it's the distinguishment of the personalities that I think defines what makes a good Superman actor to me, like someone who performs Superman, is how well can they do Superman and Clark Kent and the differences between those two.
I think also, in addition to that, when talking about character development and character creation, thinking about the current Superman, Mr. Cornsweet, I think his name is.
David Cornsweet, yeah.
And his understanding of Superman and the reason why he talks about why Superman has the suit that he has, why he wears the trunks on the outside and all of that, and the care that he took in understanding, oh, Superman doesn't want to scare children, so he
He really
dresses like he says, so he dresses like a wrestler, like, you know, he has these big larger than life colors and the underwear on the outside, and to make himself appear as non-threatening as he possibly can be. And I say that because I think that that's one, it shows his understanding of the character, and it only makes me more excited to see him play it. But also, it helps me to realize that sometimes you can take those same thoughts when you're creating characters for yourself and think about putting yourself in the head of the character you're creating and saying, why would my character do this? Why would my character say that? Why would my character act this way? And really having those deep thoughts, I think, is really, really great. And I know that it gets a lot of flack when people start talking about character creation, like, oh, what's in my character's fridge and that kind of stuff. And it's like, oh, that seems so stupid. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it plays a really big part in what a character would say. Granted, I don't really, in this exact moment, I can't give you an example of what is in my character's fridge and how that relates to what he's going to say in the scene. However, you can definitely see, the kind of purchasing decisions that a character makes might tell you a little bit about what kind of funds they have, what kind of clothing they might wear, about how they view money, how they view how other people view money, and the kinds of conversations that they'd have accordingly. So I think that's awesome. The other thing I'll say too, before we jump into the next section, is I agree as well with Jaylon about the struggle in the origin, not getting a chance to see Clark or Kal-El as he is before he, that's who he is, Kal-El, whatever. But before we get to see him be Superman, it does kind of feel, I wouldn't say it didn't feel unearned, because I think a big part of that is the score and in the settings in which they put it in, where it kind of just feels like, we all know who Superman is at this point. And also, granted, at the time in which we're all watching the film, keep in mind Superman has been around for like 80 some odd years, so it's like we all know who he is, so it doesn't feel as weird. But being a kid and in the 1978 in the movie theater for the first time, I imagine that it might have felt a little bit weird to see. The other thing too, though, is that movie is, and it's at its bare essence, a movie for kids. Like, yes, adults can enjoy it, but it is a kid. Superman is a kid's character, and so that was the thing that me and my wife were talking about, the whole campiness of the movie and just some of the stuff that was going on. Like, well, I'll get into Lex Luthor in a second, but just like in general, the campiness of it all. Once you put it through the lens of, oh, I'm supposed to be either a parent taking my kid to see this movie, or I'm a kid who grew up, spending 5 cents on a comic book, and this is kind of my chance to see the hero that I've loved on the big screen. So we overlook a lot of the shit. But now that, we're spoiled by cinema, decades of cinema, and we now know what quality film is, it's like, oh yeah, this is kind of silly. But that's okay that it's silly. But yeah, I think having the character struggle is what I was ultimately going to say, is that I think it's important for character development. I know this from personal experience. In my debut novel, which I'm working on currently, Jaylon had me. I'm going to blame you, Jaylon.
That's okay.
He had me basically rewrite the training chapters for my character. And while I hated every minute of doing it, I recognized the value of showing the character struggling to get to the part where they are the hero, and why that's so important. And I think that's important no matter what, any story you're telling, where it's about, oh, this person's going to go from here to here, any form where there's character development, which should obviously be every story. You want to make sure that we get to see where a character starts and where they end up. And I think that this movie could have done that better. But I mean, we did get to see his struggle as a teenager, and I agree with that part too. So we get to see him dealing with it, and so it's like, how much did he really learn in the Fortress of Solitude, other than like, how to not break someone's hand when he shakes it, and those kinds of things that we didn't really necessarily need to see. How did he? Because I guess the real story about Superman, though, is more about how does he function as an alien on a human world, being kind, being good, being the best example of all those things. And I think we really see him struggle to do that as a teenager. And when we see him sort of learn that lesson, everything else that he learns is kind of irrelevant. Superman's superpowers are not really the focal point of the movie. It's more about who he is. And I think that we get that real character. So I guess I'll backtrack and say that I think we do get enough of the struggle for his character development. It's just, it's not focusing on his superpowers and him being a superhero. It's more about him developing into
as a person.
A person. Right.
Right.
So I think that's why it works.
And I think that's super important for a character like Superman to show that struggle of him being human, because I think that's what certain... I think that's another tell of, like, talking about what's a tell of a good movie of Superman, of a good actor. A tell of a good movie of Superman is what makes him so relatable, is exploring that bit of the character rather than the superpower part. To your point, is how do you explore what makes him like human in a sense? What makes him what makes him both Clark Kent and Superman? Like, what the exploration of that. And I do agree that I think the 78 movie does a good job of exploring that aspect. I think I think maybe some of the others, like what I have seen of Smallville and a few others, but they had the extended runtime, did a little better. But I think the 78 movie does a pretty solid job of exploring the most important part of what makes him interesting. And that's because, other than that, if you just make him Superman, he's super powerful. Yeah, he gets more powerful with his powers. But, like, if you don't take the human aspect, I think I wouldn't say it ruins, but I think it would kind of make it less interesting of a character to me. It feels like an overpower power fantasy. I think a lot of TV shows and movies, not just with Superman, but make that mistake with characters of, like, what's the coolest way we can make them more powerful, without exploring the human side and what makes them very interesting. And I think that's the most important part about Superman to me. And that's why I like the 78 movie, as well as why I can look over some flaws of Man of Steel and a few of the others, is because I like the exploration of Clark Kent and Superman's human side, and, like, his interactions of, like, what the difference of him coming to terms with both being on Earth and both being of another planet, like you said, and how he reconciles that while also kind of making that his strength in a sense.
I agree with that.
For sure.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's jump into villain, Lex Luthor. Lex Luthor as a whole has, in my opinion, not been reflected well in live action ever. Well, no, that's not fair. I would say...
Except for Michael Rosenbaum.
Yes, Michael Rosenbaum is probably one of the best. The second runner-up to him would have to be the dude who played Abraham in Walking Dead.
You're talking about God, I know who you're talking about. Michael something.
Yeah, that redheaded dude. Yeah, him. He is probably the second runner-up because in Superman and Lois, because his version is genuinely terrifying, but he's a very different type of Lex Luthor. He's more of a brawny, big, I take no shit biker type of, almost kind of skinhead type of Lex Luthor, and it's kind of creepy.
Yeah. Which, I'd like to say, I think that's really important when you're doing adaptation and talking like that. You can push a character to be different, just don't make them so different and losing the core. So, like, the idea of big biker dude, that's not Lex Luthor at all. But if he's big biker dude, but he still represents everything Luthor stands for, you can do whatever you want, as long as it's from a good place. Versus other Luthors,
Jesse,
who do crazy, crazy things.
The fact that everyone will allow other things to walk by, but that just floats on away, or accept other things as a problem, but that's just completely acceptable. I don't get it. That's just...
I don't know.
But my fandom aside, that's what I'm saying is that doesn't feel at all like Luthor. It's just, or some weird Jim Carrey.
It's kind of weird Loki.
Yeah, it's this weird
villain.
Thing.
It's really weird.
But I can totally buy biker, but he's still a greedy SOB. As long as that's there. And I think that's important for the writing lesson. Sorry. Want to throw that in there because I think that's really important.
No, I agree too as well with that.
Yeah, I think, and if you ever get a chance to see it, the version of him in there, and it's I think what makes him, and this goes in line with the question that I'm going to ask, is the contrast between this version of Lex, the Gene Hackman version, and this Superman and Lois thing. There's a very distinct contrast, because the version of Superman and Lois, that Lex Luthor is genuinely terrifying. He's terrifying because he is relentless in his goal. And he is willing to kill and hurt and destroy any and everyone to get what he ultimately wants. And although Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor is also willing to hurt people and do things like that to get what he wants, his desires are far more campy, far more, twirl the mustache type villainy, as opposed to, you put me in jail for 20 years and now I'm out and I'm going to do everything I can to destroy you and your life and everyone that you love. That's a very different type of villain, and it's a very scary type of villain because there's no. It's always mentioned the Dark Knight Joker, and when Alfred talks about you have certain villains that can't be reasoned with and can't be bought, and you see that in Lex Luthor in this version that he can't be reasoned with. There is no negotiation. There's no even when Lois and Clark they bow down and they give him what he wants. It's still never enough. It's never like, I'm okay, cool. You've surrendered. You've done this. We're done. He's like, no, this doesn't end until you're dead. That's when this is over. When Superman is dead and your life is completely ruined, then we'll be even. And then we have this version of Gene Hackman, which is this, I'm gonna do these kinds of things. Now, I will say that Gene Hackman's villainous plan is actually a good fucking idea. I was telling my wife that. I was like millions of people dying and all that aside, this is actually a great idea. Like, I mean, I'm just gonna sink California and then I'm gonna buy up all the land, sink California, and then just become a real estate mogul that sells the land. It's like, yeah, he's creating supply and demand. He's basic entrepreneur type tactics, and it's like, yeah, is it really that bad? It's a little bit crazy. It aligns with what's his name, Tony Baker, the comedian, who's always talking about how like villains are always like, I'm gonna poison the town's water supply type of villainy, which is just super silly and it makes no sense whatsoever, but it's just funny. But I feel like Superman representing hope and altruism and being ideologically opposed to what Lex Luthor stands for, which is greed and selfishness. How do you feel that Lex Luthor's brand of villainy stacks up to modern day villainy?
Charles, did you want to go first?
No, you go, because I'll talk.
I was just going to say, I think that personally in this movie, I think Gene Hackman was done wrong by the tone of the movie, in a sense, by his character, because to your point, this is made in a time in the 70s and 80s when kids' movies were not viewed with the sense of maturity that we view them now. And so I think Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor, we made Superman this super good person. Yeah, he has some flaws, but he's a super, very sense of hope and good. So we got to oppose that with a mustache-twirling evil villain. This is before the complexity, before we started looking and realizing that children could watch like children's movies and could have a sense of complexity to them. I think this was it during the time when, yeah, there were some, like Don Bluth's children's movies at the time started getting pretty mature. But like a lot of kids' movies and things aimed at children were very much like, I don't want to say patronizing, but very much like very simple sense of good, very simple sense of evil. And I think Lex Luthor was done dirty by that in here, because I think Gene Hackman, I've seen him as an actor, as a villain, could have pulled off perfect Lex Luthor to the comic. But I think he was done wrong by the fact that we needed a very simple sense of evil to go against our simple sense of good of a 1978 children's film. And I think that's why a lot of the more recent Lex Luthors, as well as some of the TV Lex Luthors, where things got a bit more mature and we aimed at a slightly, I don't want to say older audience, but we, as time progressed, we've realized that things like Spider-Verse can exist where you have complex villains for children. And I think that's why Luthors have gotten better over time, is because we started to realize that you don't have to make them like super complicated, but you can have some fun with like a level of like a Lex Luthor where he's both evil, but also like there's the sense of a character, what makes him human the same way what makes Superman human. And I think that was what shackled Gene Hackman in the 70s version, and a lot of the other villains in a lot of the older films too, is that we shackled them to that simplistic sense. And I don't think that worked for Lex Luthor, because I don't think he is that simplistic sense of a villain. Like it's one thing if he's intended to be, like the Emperor in Star Wars is a very simplistic like level of evil. I'm going to take over the galaxy. It worked for him as a character because he was nothing beyond that as he was written. But I think Lex Luthor was written with a bit more interesting complexity, but the movie shackled him to that idea. And the Michael Rosenbaums, the guy Abraham from The Walking Dead, sometimes it goes a little too far like Jesse Eisenberg, but other ones, you know, the level that we've come to now where we've kind of changed it more towards the audience and changed our view of how we view children's entertainment and where we can go with that, I think has helped Lex Luthor become more interesting. Like even to the animated TV show, like Lex Luthor as played by Clancy Brown in the TV shows is both a mustache-twirling evil villain, but also has some elements that make him interesting and human. And I think we started to learn that when that TV show started to come out, that we could be a bit more complicated with how we approach topics like that to children and young adults.
Yeah,
I agree with that. So yeah, I was just going to say I agree with that because being of the generation where I grew up seeing both the simplistic villains of, you know, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then more recently the more complex villains aimed towards children, I definitely saw that difference. And Lex Luthor in this movie, I genuinely liked the character because he made me laugh, because he reminded me of simplistic villains that were just goofy from my younger years. And, like, as a concept, his evil genius plan does represent some real evil that happens in today's society, I think, where you have, like, people just driven by greed, locking themselves in their castles and thinking that they can control the world. But I will pass it on to Charles because I feel like you have a lot more insight here.
It's an interesting thing, and I don't want to steamroll everyone because I know I can do that, especially for something that I love like this. But it's interesting that, like, personally, I love Gene Hackman in this movie. I love the Luthor. He's just fun. He's a great villain, and I dig him, and it works for this movie because it is that style of, again, that romantic, daydreaming childhoodness, which I think is fun, and it's great. Here's what I think is really interesting, and I still love this movie, and I still love this version of Luthor, is that fun fact. Luthor, as I grew up with him in the cartoon, the comics, and everything, as everyone knows him, is he's an evil, rich capitalist. So my favorite Luthor will always be Clancy Brown from the cartoons, as Brian said, because the voice, that tone, he's perfect. And Luthor is the perfect evil villain nemesis for Superman because he's everything against Superman. And I remember my dad told me once, it's like, you know, I asked him when we were talking about why does he hate Superman? And he goes, because he can't own him. That's why Luthor hates Superman. And it always just interested me of that concept of everything with him. Luthor did not used to be an evil capitalist. And when this movie came out, he was a mad scientist. And there is a goofy story about he hates Superman because when they were young, an accident happened and he made him lose his hair. Okay. This kind of silverish, and I love that stuff. I love it. It's goofy and I love it. But it's, from a dramatic point of view, it's a little ridiculous. But the reason, and this is what I find it interesting, it's like, well, why can't this movie just be silly fun? For example, Green Goblin, what's his plan in the original Spider-Man movie? Gods, I just said original, I'm so old. But what's his plan? He just, you know, let's do this whole thing, Spider-Man, you know, blow stuff up. You know, okay, fine, whatever. And that's fine, totally works. And actually, there is an interesting concept, that first movie of ego. There's a whole brilliant underlying theme of ego in that movie, in that trilogy, but that's a different conversation. But what's interesting is, I agree with you that the thing about this movie is, and I adore this movie, and it means a hell of a lot to me, but I think having a mad scientist, it's kind of weird. There's just something about the underground fortress. And again, I love it. It's great. But the reason I bring it up is that, here's the thing. This movie is almost perfect. And I say almost perfect because it builds up to something. And then it's just Superman flying around with 70s effects that, and I'm not like this, I think are good, but not great. They're mostly convincing. And the third act is him kind of flying around. And honestly, I'm entertained, but it's not as much. And I never really quite thought this before, but I think if you did have a Luthor that was a little nastier, I think it would have built up to a lot of what the movie was talking about by that point. But when you do have a mad scientist, it's almost like Superman is here to be the light to show the way against loony bins. Okay, great, cartoon villains. Which is why I always thought it was kind of interesting that, yeah, he saves Lois with the helicopter, and then he goes around and stops bank robbers. Okay, that's the thing that Superman could do. And it's interesting because as much as I love this movie, this was the movie that actually got me to think, is Superman only really good with the origin? And I started reading a bunch of comics in my library, and that's what made me go from Superman fan to Uber Duper fan, because I was reading all these different stories. I'm like, I didn't know you could do this with Superman, because I kind of felt this was it. And I feel if you did have someone who was a little bit nastier, and not just nastier, but I think more realistic, because Kevin Spacey basically plays this version in Superman Returns. And there's a bit in that movie where he kicks the crap out of Superman, and it's heartbreaking to watch.
Mm-hmm.
But he's still a mad scientist. It's still like this goofy thing. And again, I love it, but I think you do need Superman to have a bite for a lot of these points to be made about what Clark stands for and what Clark wants to be and what he can't be. So it's interesting. And the reason I also bring all this together to put a point on this is we, 2025, we look back at this movie from 78 and we go, oh, it's so quaint. Oh, gee willikers. Fun fact, there's a making of documentary that's hosted by Christopher Reeve. And he says to 1978 audiences, well, we weren't sure in this post-Watergate world if people would accept our vision. I'm like, oh, gods, it's Turtles all the way down. So the idea of the 70s and post-Watergate stuff that they couldn't accept Superman, it leads me to kind of think maybe you guys are right in that sense, where it's like maybe you do need a little bit more of an edge of a villain for Superman, because maybe the audience was ready for that. Considering that Nixon literally, I am not a crook. We joke about this now, especially because there's so much horrible things that happen in recent history. But really think back to the time, of our parents. The president of the United States just said he lied and he cheated, and now I'm out of office. That's harrowing stuff. That's not stuff you think about in the 70s. So maybe you could have had that a little bit more with both. And I find that very fascinating. I hadn't really thought that before, but I think that's interesting. But yeah, so basically, long story, Gene Hackman, he works. I love him. But I feel like this movie and the duology of Superman, these two movies, I love them to death. But they never quite reached that pinnacle of a concluding point. And I know there's a lot of production history for that reason, but that's why I say almost perfect. This movie builds and builds and builds too. And I find that fascinating, as much as I love them.
I also think that the Lex Luthor thing, you talk about the origin of Lex Luthor and back in the day where it was like, oh yeah, Superman caused me to lose my hair and I hate him because of that. One of the things that I loved about Smallville was, one, they did do kind of a nod to that in the sense that Lex Luthor becomes bald because of the meteor shower that Clark comes down on Earth in, and he doesn't hate Clark for that, but it's just an interesting thing. But the thing that I always loved about the devolving of the Clark Kent Lex Luthor relationship is because in Smallville, Clark Kent and Lex Luthor are best friends for a large part of that series. And then it's one of the things that I always love looking back on shows where you can look at the villain and you can say, well, the villain was kind of right for what. And when you look at Lex Luthor's evolution to the villain in Smallville, he's right. His whole reason for hating Clark was because Clark lied to him over and over and over and over again for no other reason than just he couldn't trust him. No matter what Lex did, no matter how much Lex tried to prove to be worthy of the truth and his honesty and his friendship, Clark continuously lied. And that ultimately pushed Lex further and further to the dark side, to the point where, he ultimately turned on him. Which is why I've always loved Michael Rosenbaum's version of Lex Luthor, because of it. Again, it's one of those things where you have a lot longer to tell a story. So, you have 10 years to do it. Granted, Lex Luthor was only on the show for 7 of those 10 years, but even in that, you still get to see that kind of
Still 7 years of time.
Yeah, the 7 years to kind of show this person who you love from the beginning. Because I've always loved Lex. I was like, oh, he's Clark's big brother. He's always outsmarting his dad, and he's like this really cool guy. And then you get to slowly but surely see him kind of lose his mind and his obsession with Clark's secret and aliens and all of these other things. And I've always loved the versions of Lex where it's care about, even though we know he's greedy, we know that he's a capitalist, there's this part of him that genuinely cares about humanity, and that version of him that cares about humanity and thinks that Superman could be a threat to that. I've always thought that was a threat to humanity in general, even though he does all these superheroic things. That what if one day he decides to not? You know what I mean? And I love that's kind of the thing. The same way that they kind of introduced John Henry Irons in the Superman and Lois show, where his whole thing is he comes from a different multiverse where Superman basically had a bad day and murdered everybody, and he hates Superman for that reason. And he's just like, what happens if your Superman does that? And I'm gonna try to take him out. But it makes me think about our villains. And I wonder, looking at Gene Hackman, do you think that a villain like Gene Hackman, the Lex Luthor villain that we have now, could work today, ever? Is there ever a time or space for a villain like that, besides the Emperor? Because even the Emperor in Star Wars was more... That was also acceptable for the 70s and the 80s in general. So I don't even think... I guess you can ask the same question about the Emperor. Do characters like that, do the mustache twirling villains who are a little bit campy and overtly menacing for menacing's sake, do those work today? Is there room for those types of things? Is there ever a time where that's okay?
I think it depends.
Well, you say your point, Brad, because they were going to say the same thing.
Yeah, I think it depends on the tone you're going for in your film.
Depends on the tone, If
you're going for a serious, self-serious, or even like a little bit of realistic tone, I don't think a Gene Hackman villain works. But if you're going for a campy, fun time, like Marvel's done this before too. Some of the better Marvel villains have been ones that are relatively mustache-twirling, fun. There's also some of the better ones that are more complex characters that have a lot going for, like Killmonger in the Black Panther series I found interesting, because they gave him a backstory and interesting stuff. But also there are other times like Thanos had a lot of interesting stuff about his as a character. But there's also some others that are just evil for the sake of evil. And I think it works if that are just goofy with the mustache twirling, having a little fun, hamming it up. I mean, even in the Spider-Man movies, like some of the villains that they pick relatively recently, the second one, I don't think there's a real redeeming factor for Jake Gyllenhaal played Mysterio, I think, in that second one. I don't think there was a real redeeming factor for him, but Jake Gyllenhaal was having a blast as that character. And even some of them, like Willem Dafoe, they gave him a bit more depth as they went along, but Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin is pretty hammy and having a good time just cheesing it up. And it really works for Spider-Man and the sequels that use Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin. I think it just depends. And then you have the more sympathetic side, like Doc Ock in the second one. And it just kind of depends on the tone. It's just what kind of movie are you trying to make? What kind of story are you trying to tell? What kind of dichotomy between the good and the bad are you trying to approach? And that to me is kind of just what. But yes, to long story short, long rant later, I will say that I agree, or I will say that I think that Lex Luthor or Gene Hackman could work as a villain. It just depends on what movie you're trying to make and what type of tone you're going.
Yeah, make them interesting and make them serve the point of the story. So Green Goblin, he's a ton of fun. I struggle watching that movie and not quoting Willem Dafoe with the voice because he's just amazing. But, like I said, he doesn't have to be interesting. You don't have to make a redeeming character in that movie. He's just an a-hole. Ta-da! And it totally works for what that movie's trying to say, because Green Goblin has no responsibility. He doesn't care. It's about him and no one else. Ta-da! So you can totally do a Gene Hackman character, but you would have to find a way to make that work if you're doing something a little bit more serious. Or you don't have to do something serious. Works for that too.
I think a chaotic, crazy... Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I was gonna say, just the nostalgia in me really wants movies to still exist where there's a villain I can laugh at. Because sometimes, even as an adult, the world is too heavy, the real life villains are too heavy, and I need a villain that I can laugh at. But make the tone of the film, make the rest of the film match that tone. Because otherwise, it feels like you're trying to be humorous, but you're taking yourself too seriously at the same time.
I think that was the problem with Jesse Eisenberg, actually, is I think the tone of that movie is so self-serious at times, and Jesse is admittedly not a very good Lex Luthor, but he's at least hamming it up and having some cheeseball fun with not a good character, but a somewhat attempt at Lex Luthor, and I think that's what made him not work so much, is because he's just cheesing it up in a movie that I don't think tonally works for that cheese. Like, it's not, there's nothing in Batman versus Superman that asks for that.
Batman versus Superman: Dawn of Justice, Brian.
Okay, Batman versus Superman: Dawn of Justice. There's nothing in that Snyder disaster of that movie that makes it, like, asks for Jesse Eisenberg to cheese it up like he's doing. Because the rest of the movie, Batman and Superman are so self-serious, there's not that level of hope in it at all. And so when he comes on screen and just goofballs it up, look at me, I'm Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor, it just totally doesn't work. And that's why I don't fully blame him for that failure either. I think he could have been okay with better writing. I don't think he was, don't get me wrong, I don't think he would ever make my top Lex Luthors, but I think he could have been okay with better writing.
Yeah.
But I just
Jesse Eisenberg, you know?
he was not helped by a movie that didn't know what tone it wanted to get. So to Charles and Chalon's point there, I think both the tone of that could work, and sometimes I like that. I want that level of goofball fun. Like, I don't necessarily need to see more rich billionaires destroy the world. I'm witnessing that every day. Like,
True.
Yeah.
I can have some fun with watching Lex Luthor. Well, ha ha ha.
Yeah.
I don't know if I mean, I don't want to say I disagree with you guys, because I don't disagree. I think that they can exist, and I think there is room for them. And I don't want to confuse what I prefer to write to what should or should not exist. Personally,
once more for those on the back, by the way, that is very important for this.
Yeah, like
for what we are trying to accomplish with this podcast, that is very important to understand, because even I screw up that a lot of times.
Yeah. So for me, I prefer to write sympathetic or empathetic villains. I prefer villains that are complex, that have more to them than just I'm here to be evil for the fun of it. That being said, it's not, I can't say that there's no place for them in the world. I don't enjoy watching them personally. And I won't even say I don't enjoy watching them completely, because there are some that I've seen that are, it's like, okay, cool. If I know that that's what I'm going into the movie for, and I'm going into, or I'm reading a book because I know this is supposed to be a blockbuster, good time type of thing, and it's not meant to make me think, even though I prefer philosophical type of stuff. Obviously, everybody who knows me knows that's my thing. I like those kinds of things more. But if I'm going to watch something that's not that, I'm okay with something that's a little bit more, you know, yeah, I'm here to, see, I'm going to, like, okay, fine, whatever. Yeah, I agree. I think that is something that you as a writer, if you're listening to this, have to understand, is that, yes, it is okay to, you'll hear it a lot when you hear about people doing reviews for your books or whatever, and the villain is just so one dimensional, and they don't have any real point, or there's no emotional thing to them, and it's like, and it makes you start to feel like, okay, well then I have to give him like a daughter who's sick in order to whatever, but that has like literally nothing to do with your story. And it's like, so you don't have to. If you're, I agree completely in the sense that you guys are right. If the story calls for it, do it. And I think that's just kind of the case for anything. Tone, however, I think is the last thing we're going to talk about before we get out of here. And that is the tone for this movie. So this movie, there's a question I want to ask, and I want you guys to think about it before you answer it. But the question being, could a movie like this work today? Or would audiences demand a grittier tone? And before you answer that, I think on my side of things. I think that my answer to this question is no. I don't believe that this version of Superman, this type of movie, could exist today. That is not to say that James Gunn's version, I think James Gunn's version will be great, because I think James Gunn's version isn't going to do what this film tried to do. This film did what Man of Steel did, but Man of Steel just did it in a different time, because Superman, the 1978 version, was ultimately the vision that Richard Donner ultimately had was a real world where Superman exists in it. Which is why, as colorful and hopeful and bright as it is, it's still very much a real world with real problems and a real environment, the gritty city and all of those kinds of things. It didn't feel like that because, it was so colorful and it was so, bright and so campy. But overall, it was the same general world that Zack Snyder was going for, which was a real world with a superhuman in it, and how would the world react to that? The difference is, in 1978, the way the world would react to a Superman was very different than the way the world would react to Superman in 2013. In 2013, Superman was old-fashioned, and Superman didn't matter, and Superman and was a goody two-shoes. He was overpowered. He was not Batman. He was all of those types of things. And in that world, we wanted to see a Superman that was dark. The world treated him as if he should have been darker. And that's why the movie was darker. But in 1978, you had a much, regardless of the Watergate scandals and all things that were going on, you had a much more, I want to say almost a less jaded society than we were in 2013. Which makes me a little bit worried about the Superman film of 2025, because I think we are far more jaded now than we were in 2013, than we definitely were in 1978. We've gone through terrorist attacks and 2 financial crises, COVID, and all these other things. We are shot. We need Superman now more than ever. But I don't know. I think when you create stuff like Superman, when you create characters like Superman, you have to, I know it's not, you get the advice as a creative to not create for the times, not to create for the trends and things like that. But I do think that it's important to think about the audience that you are telling your story for and where they are in society. Right now, hopeful stories are necessary because there is no hope anywhere. As the expression goes, they have burnt the circus and we have no bread. That is the world that we live in right now. We have Donald Trump becoming president as of today. When you hear this, he would have been president for over a month, I think, by now. But at this point, he's becoming president today, and we have a world where, his first executive order is to acknowledge that there will only be 2 genders. Like, this is the world that we live in right now. So when you think about where we were in 1978, think about where we were in 2013, think about where we are now. And I think that it's hard to say that a movie like Superman could exist the way that it was then today and be accepted the way that it was then to where it is now. No matter what people say, as far as like, we're getting hope back, and we're getting the fucking tights on the outside back, and we're getting, and I'm excited about that. Regardless of what people say, I think it really depends on where we are. So I wonder what you guys think about that. And I also want you guys to touch on the thought of thinking about your audience and where they currently are when you put something out into the world, and how important that is.
I agree with the advice to not create for the trends, but I disagree with the advice not to create for the time that you are living in, because I think that has to do with knowing your audience, because the most important thing your story has to do is connect with people, and in order for people to connect with it emotionally, they need to relate. So you need to write a story that people are going to relate to. And the only way you do that is by knowing your audience, knowing what is at the forefront of their mind, what they have been struggling with the most recently, the kinds of philosophical questions that they're entertaining given the time that they are living on this earth. Those things are important if you're going to make a story that resonates with people. And I think you can track this through all the ages, Because when you look back on, comedy is a really easy example. When you look back on comedy from, 50 years ago, people laughed at different things because different things connected with them. They understood things in different ways. The Superman movie that we're talking about was great for its time, for its audience of young children. But nowadays, it wouldn't connect with people. People would be thinking more critically about, why is he in love with Lois? What did she ever do to deserve him being in love with her? This was one that made me laugh, and I think I destroyed my husband's life asking this question, but why is Superman, who is technically a different species, in love with a human? So, all these different things that, people are going to think critically about, because we are in an age where we're having to think critically about so many different things than people back in the 70s had to. So I think in that sense it is very important to know the audience that you are writing a story for. And in that sense, it's important to understand the time that you're living in. Some things, though, are timeless. Hope is timeless. It just needs to be delivered in different ways. You need to acknowledge different kinds of hopelessness in order to deliver a hope that feels realistic, if that makes sense.
I agree 100% with that statement, and it actually ties into something I was going to say earlier with the villain bit. Is I think certain things need to transform over time with the audience, and certain things have transformed over time with the audience, and they're the same generalized concept, but it's just changing with the times. So to answer your question about do I think it could be made the same? I don't think it could be made the same, but I do think the same generalized concept could be made today with a few updates for things. I think you could have the hope and the emotion, and I think you can have the fun of the 78 Superman movie updated slightly for how we view things now, because I don't think hope has gone away. To your point, hope doesn't go away. It just changes forms. Something that was hopeful in the 70s will not be as hopeful for us in the 2000s. Will still be hope, something else comes around that we find and view as hopeful. And so I think the tone of a Superman movie and the tone of that one in particular could be translated to a modern audience without changing too much. You just need to Talon's point there, just take a bit of what modern audiences looks for hope and what they view as hopeful, and transfer that to Superman without intrinsically changing the movie. But I'm a person that can both enjoy a dour, monstrous A24 horror film, and then the next day want to sit there and watch Superman from the 70s. I love that kind of cheeseball fun at the same time. It just depends what mood I'm in. It depends what kind of I'm probably not going to leave the same day that we just had all the politics of today come out and watch something that's dour and terrible, because that's not going to help my mood right now. Probably today's a day to watch, Guardians of the Galaxy, watch something fun and funny, it kind of just, so to long story short, Superman can be translated, in my opinion. It just needs to update slightly and I'm not even talking about politics of modern days. I'm not even talking about ideologies and things of certain days, because I feel like that is appropriate in movies, but it kind of just depends what kind of movie you're trying to tell. I'm just meaning the generalized, what we as the audience view as good, what we view as hope, and what we view as hopeful changes with the times. And so I think Superman just would need to, I don't want to say appropriate because that's a bad word to use for that, but if you're writing a Superman film for today, you can take aspects of that, bring it in, keep the tone of the 78 film, but change it ever so slightly to kind of approach how we as a viewing audience have changed over time. And that's also not just talking about visual effects either, because visual effects obviously have improved over time and things like that. But that's just storytelling wise. There's ways, because what made Superman is still today. To my point about John Williams' score, that is the epitome of what Superman score or superhero scores are now, is defined by the fanfare of the dun 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 dun. There's elements of that that Superman march in it. You know, not the Dark Knight, obviously, but like Marvel as a whole and other movies use that. And I think I think that influence is still felt, and I think it's still possible to use bits of it, you know. And with the villain comment earlier, what I was saying is I think the mustache twirling villain is used today. One of the most famous ones is very different from Lex Luthor, but the Joker in The Dark Knight. He is a simple, chaotic villain. Has no good background. Like, he has nothing about him that says any of his backstory. He has nothing to make him sympathetic in a sense, because you know by the end every story he tells is a lie. But he's that same, very obviously different than the Lex Luthor type villain, but that same concept just transformed for the time to be different. It's the same concept of a villain that's got no real redeeming qualities, but yet he's enigmatic the same way, because he's just transformed the same concept to reflect a different time, reflect different fears, reflect different ideologies and ideas. And so I think the Superman as a whole movie could do that, be the same general concept and idea, just transferred.
Jared, what was your question? Not the Superman question, but the writing question, real quick, because I was listening to your two words and I forgot because I was listening to you too.
Not the could it be made today, but
Yeah,
more
part two. Yeah.
Part two is I actually forgot what it was now that I've Jaylon, do you remember what it was? I usually rely on Jaylon to remember what I said.
I don't know why you do, because I have the
I'm
worst
so sorry.
short-term memory.
Because you usually come through when I ask, so I just it's your
fault.
Sorry,
my rambling ruined the thought here. That was not my intention.
I think it was something about, like, could this story work today? Do you tell the story to an audience of the time, or do you tell audience of the time and according to the trends, or do you tell a story that is just a good story?
So here's the thing: no one knows about trends at all. Period. Don't listen to them. No one knows what's good, what's bad. So forget that. Okay. So if whoever's listening and writing, don't bother. It's stupid. Do your thing.
Trends change quickly.
Yeah, and it's just beyond a waste of time to do that. Just do your thing. But what's interesting about that is, for me, I do find this movie to be timeless because it feels, again, like this fairy tale, this make-believe thing. Oh, and by the way, really quick, to that end, the geekiness, I have to answer this. Superman loves Lois because she's brilliant. That's why.
Okay.
It's a love story. It's always been a love story. And so to that end, you just kind of fall for it. Superman always falls for Lois Lane. But I mean that in the sense that it's not like Peter Parker and Mary Jane, where they have some screwed up things in them. The comics do this. They did do it brilliantly. Story for another day. But that's Superman. And I love that myth. I love this blend of myth, and I love this blend of romantic daydream. And there's like a sheen to this whole movie that makes it look and feel like that. And I think it's brilliant. I think it works anytime. It'll still feel this way 20 years from now because it stood the test of time, because everyone goes, well, this movie needs to be like now. Yeah, the movie came out 5 years ago. Shut up. Like, who knows if it's going to last? I've been dealing with that since I was in high school. The point being, though, that's really important to note, though, is that movies, you can't replicate something like this because you can't. Like, I finally kind of gave up on that. Like, oh, I wish movies were more like Lord of the Rings. Fantastic. Never going to happen. Move on. Not because people suck, but because the only time you could have made it is then. That's how life works. You can try to go and do throwbacks and bring back different styles, different techniques and themes and concepts. That's fine.
Even throwbacks, though, take elements of the modern day. Watching a show like Stranger Things or something has a modern day view of the 80s. It doesn't have a view of the 80s from the 80s.
Yeah. So that's totally fine and totally cool, but it's never going to capture that. And that's okay. That's totally okay. So the fact that this Superman movie only exists now is totally fine. And Brian, you said that really perfectly. And I really hope that the new film is like that, because I do think it is important to have Superman. I love what you said, Jaylon, about the hopelessness. It has to be adapted to that because there are different things of then and now. And I've had a lot of Superman ideas for like little one-shot stories, and I doodled a script, a film script for a little bit. I think it was like 30, 40 pages, I think it was. But then I had to do other work. And I tried to do that because you don't want something to stick in the silver age of comics of 50s and 60s. You do need to keep it going. Not because the old stuff sucks, but because that's how life works. It's a conveyor belt. What I find fascinating, though, is, would audiences accept the movie today if it was like this? Here's what's interesting. I'm of two minds about this. Mind number one is no, because audiences are stupid. They're really stupid, and we're not allowed to say that. Oh, we're not allowed to say that. No, audience is so smart. It's the studios totally.
I can see the headline now.
Horse.
Charles Rodriguez insults audiences.
No, audiences are stupid. They're stupid. What they want is stupid. Their critiques are stupid. Their tastes are stupid. They look at something like this and go, why is it like this? Because everyone has to be a pseudo-intellectual. Like, no one can just be an athlete anymore. No, they have to be nerds, pushing us actual nerds out of the equation. So they look at this one and go, well, that's really lame. You know, they can't say gay anymore like they used to. Well, that's really gay, like when I was a teenager. So they just updated the insult. But it's the same spirit. They look at this and they go, that's stupid. Why isn't it like this? Because they don't care. They're really, really stupid. But, right, the other angle that exists at the same time is they're not stupid. They're really smart. And they do want good things. And they do want something that's wonderful. And they do want something that's positive and better. I've heard people all the time look at these superhero movies and they go, why are they so serious? Why is it like this? It's ridiculous, right? Because they want something more. And it's kind of fascinating. Speaking of the 70s, is basically the history of cinema of the 70s is basically between Jaws and Rocky, especially. And then, so I mean, literally you had Rocky, the original Star Wars, and Superman. That's insane in terms of having these stories about positive ideals against some really serious stuff, especially Rocky. Rocky, that's a different conversation for another day. But what's interesting is that there's a conversation. I think actually going back to Lindsay Ellis, I was talking about her in a previous episode. She made a really good comment where she's like, people back in the day thought, oh, well, no one in the 70s wants Star Wars. They needed Star Wars. They needed that. And the same thing she said with Titanic. And I was like, well, no, in 1990, the sophisticated era of 1997, was it 98? I can't remember.
It's 97.
It was 97, thank you. 97 would ever accept Titanic. And they did, because they needed it and they wanted it. So what's interesting is and so I had to grow up through all this new 52 Man of Steel. Superman doesn't work as a character because of blah, 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 blah. And it was painful. We're beyond that. We're on like a new Superman renaissance right now, to be honest. Every time I pick up a comic book issue, a new issue, it's like the coolest thing in the world. But people do want that. They just don't know it until you show it to them. And that happens to me all the time. I don't know that I want a specific drama, and I'm like, that's exactly what I wanted. And what I think is really important to note in that sense is, it just because you're dark and gritty and bleh doesn't mean you're of the time. And just because you're past and romantic and fairy tale doesn't mean you're old-fashioned. Just do you. Because there's always going to be those people who always go like, no, that movie couldn't exist now. The movie couldn't be accepted today. The book couldn't be accepted. No one wants this, blah, 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 blah. Fine. Audiences are stupid. They let Transformers 1 go and they ignore that film. But it will live on because it means something. So it'll come back. So the same thing with Superman. Yeah, let the people think, oh no, this is dumb if it came out today. And I think people would reject it because people are really stupid, period. But I also think there would be an audience for this because people aren't stupid. Not that they have to like this movie or else they're stupid, but they can accept the fact that it is different. And they're not like, if it's not A from what Disney sells me, then what could it be? That's what I'm trying to say. Not like, if they don't like this movie, they're stupid. It's not that. But they can accept, oh, this is different. Because they do want something different. But also, they're stupid and they don't. So what do you do with these two paradoxes? Just do what you want. Do what you want because at the end of the day, at least you'll be happy. And then if people want to throw it away or take it with them, let them do it, because at the end, it's kind of like the only voice in your head you have to account for is your own. So that's my 2 cents to that I hope made sense.
And I agree with that in a sense.
I do. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that is a view that I understand where that comes from. I think before I ask my final question, I think that for the listener, I think you have to think about when we say don't chase trends. I agree with that in the sense of like, oh, everybody's doing vampires right now, so I should go and write a vampire book. Don't chase that, because I can almost guarantee you that the amount of time that it takes for you to write and do everything you're going to do, by the time it comes out, that whatever that was that made everybody love it is going to probably be over. And I think that's why people generally say don't chase trends. However, recognizing the world that you currently live in is important. One of the things that it's a weird piece of advice, but one of the best pieces of advice I can give anybody who's a writer is get on TikTok. Get on TikTok. You don't have to like, everything people do, but if you want a clear understanding of where we are as a culture right now at any given moment, TikTok is a great example of it. You'll hear a lot of stupid ideas and a lot of terrible things that people think and horrible. You'll get a lot of hate, but you will get a clear picture of what the culture is. And if you're going to write something, I think it is important to understand what the culture is in any given time. If I'm going to write a Superman movie, or I'm going to write a Superman novel, if I'm going to do any of those types of things and I want to put it in a world that people that are going to read it are currently living in, I need to understand what kind of culture we are currently living in. And yes, you can have hope and you can have all of those things that Superman represents and still live in that world and still live in that environment. I think that the reason why Superman of 1978 can't exist today is more than just the special effects. It's more than just, the campiness of it. I think it's also, there's a lot of problematic stuff in that movie that, like, today in our politically correct world, looking at that movie is kind of like, I don't know if I would say that today. Like, those kinds of things are also important. I think overall, I just think it's important to keep track of that. And I know it's hard to do because, again, in editing my book, I've learned that, I've been working on my novels since 2016. It's so the character, and I've noticed that, like, going back and reading it and the kind of references I was making, the kinds of stuff that was happening is completely different now. And it's like, this wouldn't really make as much sense. And I don't know if I could actually say that now, that kind of thing. So it's really hard to keep track of where society is and create things, even in movies, because writing a screenplay to wrapping on a film to finishing editing and all that stuff, that takes a really long time, and the world that you start creating for may be very different by the time you're done creating the thing you're creating.
Absolutely.
And so I think you just kind of have to try to keep your finger on the pulse, try to keep it, I say don't aim for classics, don't aim for timeless things, because I've come to realize that classic and timeless things happen naturally. They aren't things that you can just make happen. So at least in my experience, I've never seen anybody who's set out to do a timeless thing or create a classic actually make a classic or do something timeless when that was the intent. So just learn to sort of keep a finger on the pulse, and then just like Charles said, kind of make what you want to make and let that be where you are. Let that be how you proceed. Last question I'm going to ask. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say I agree wholeheartedly, and I think that's the difference between keeping your finger on the pulse of like ideologies of like what's going on, how things have changed, and chasing trends. I think chasing trends is something as simplistic as like, hey, Twilight was big, so let's do vampire things. That's a big thing. And I would say, personally, never do that, because I feel like you're not making art as you enjoy it. But on the other hand, I think chasing what makes individuals now like something we approach, it's how I view a difference between like how I can enjoy a movie. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen, it's a really bizarre and creepy film. It's called I Saw the TV Glow.
I've been meaning to.
It was
I saw that trailer when it was just before it was released. I was like, and I missed it.
Yeah, and it was a very interesting film, and it explores the trans experience, like someone being trans and like from a trans filmmaker. Whereas versus like how Disney would approach it as like, this is popular right now to talk about this, so I'm going to put this character in a film, but without any depth or any exploration of why we're talking about that right now. I think that's the difference between that. You're approaching the same ideology and discussion. One is talking about it from the perspective, whereas the other one is just putting it in there because it's what's trendy and popular right now in their view. And I think that's the difference. And to your comment on that is approaching, it's just having your finger on the pulse of what's popular now is in what we're talking about now, but like talking about it with having a story to tell and having something interesting to say about it. Whereas versus just chasing something because, like Pearl Harbor that came out right after Titanic. It failed because it was just Michael Bay chasing off the trend of romance in a disaster is popular right now. That's why it failed.
No, I get that.
It's a different approach of things. But sorry, I just wanted to comment on that because I agree wholeheartedly with your comment and wanted to say I think that's the difference between those two ideas and why one of them fails, whereas one of them I think constantly works. And what you were saying constantly works is keeping that finger on the pulse always while avoiding just chasing popular. TikTok, to your point also, is a good thing to approach because you find while you don't want to chase the trends of TikTok, you can look at what people are talking about, like what politics are big, what discussions are big. And if you have something interesting to say off of that, are unique or creative to say off of that, I think that would make a great film and very interesting. I was fascinated. I had a story idea I wrote a while back that I don't know if I'll ever approach again, but it was an idea I wrote a bit down because I was fascinated by what happened with the healthcare situation with the healthcare CEO a couple months ago. That situation and people's response to that was fascinating to me. So I had a darkly comic idea that approached it not because, it's big right now, but because looking at how the news stations, how individuals on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and my friends and family approach that, and people from different aspects of different aisles of the political spectrum and everything approach that fascinated me. I was like, that's so interesting. I'm interested how people responded to what happened with that guy and what happened with Luigi. I can't remember his name. That was the guy that did that.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. And so it's not like, now obviously I would take it with some respect because actual people will hurt in that situation. You never want to, that's another thing you got to go is you never want to take advantage of a situation. But it's kind of like the Titanic in a sense of like approaching an interesting story where people were genuinely hurt, but trying to say something and having some fun with that idea or concept at the same time. Not literal fun, but you know what I mean. Philosophical.
To repeat Charles's words of wisdom, if it matters, it will endure.
100%.
Very true. Okay, so last question. This one is more of a rapid fire thing, but it's meant to be creative. So, if you could change one thing about this film story, what would it be?
Planet, the turning planet thing. I'm sorry, I don't like it at all. And I know the original plan was not to have him turn it. It was the missile thing. I know the production, this history. I love this movie, and it ties in with Superman 2, so I know a lot about these movies. But it's dumb.
Mm-hmm.
It's too much for me. I first heard about this from a Robot Chicken skit, okay? And I thought it was just with Santa Claus, the whole thing, right? I thought this was like a joke. And then I saw the movie and I was like, what? And this ties in with Superman 2 or something where his choice needs to have consequence. This is where it gets messy. But I would just, I don't know, tighten a little bit of the ending a little bit so Lois isn't over here and Superman's not over here, and a little bit more and something that isn't turning the world back, but we still have consequence.
I hate it.
So, Jaylon, that's what I'm trying to say. I love this movie, but I don't see it with rose-tinted glasses, so I understand your point.
hate it.
Please, everyone, I'm really not trying to be an a-hole geek here. I that is the least thing I'm trying to be. Anyone who knows me, I really, really try.
We know
not to
you,
be an
Charles.
a-hole geek.
I hate
We know
that
you and
part
we love
too,
you.
so it's
I
totally
try to be
fine.
good.
I hate that part. I went on an hour-long rant about the stupidity of that moment and how
He knows it'll work.
I turned into the whole, well, actually, guy to my wife about how, like, you know, the planet is moving at 800 miles an hour at any given moment. And if he had done that, how everyone on the planet would have been dead immediately just by doing that. And he did that for some woman that he only knew for a few months. It's just stupid. And it makes me mad.
Doesn't make sense. What would I do with it? I can't think. I can't think of what I would have done except
it just wouldn't have been in the movie.
I don't.
Lois would just be dead. That would be the end of that. I would say if I wrote myself into that corner, that's what's happening.
Yeah.
Agree wholeheartedly with that. And honestly, that's what I would change too.
You made your corner, now sit in it.
Yeah, exactly. If I wrote that, that's just what it's going to have to be.
Here's my pitch. Because I know the whole point originally was basically, he was going to throw the missile and save the day, and that's what lets in Zod and Ursa and what's his name, out of their prison. So maybe what you could have done was that basically it's like, I have to go and save her. So maybe he does, and I'm spitballing here, he does something so fast that he's able to save her, but the ricochet of it, that's what causes the prison phantom zone to break out or something. I don't know. Just not spinning around. And the thing is, this was going to be the original finale for the second one.
Oh my God.
So we were just never going to escape this. And it doesn't work in that one too. Because
I would have.
I know that my personal favorite version of Superman 2 would be a combination of the theatrical cut and the Richard Donner cut. I just haven't found it yet. You know. So anyway, it doesn't work for me. And this is coming from, you know, I literally sat in a library and I read a bunch of Silver Age Superman comic books. I'm like, so like I know all this stuff and it doesn't work for me because it doesn't feel right. Everything else feels right. That doesn't feel right. I'm sorry. I'm done now.
All right, Brian, what would you change?
I would change the same part, but a different aspect of it. I hate the going back in time, but what I would have changed is I don't think in this movie Lois should have died and it should have done that whole thing. I feel like it wasn't earned as much as it could have been. Like waiting for the second one, maybe, but to me, it makes the character feel a little too much like a plot device at that final bit there, but also B, to your point, why would this person go all the way around and pretty much destroy the world for this woman he just met a few months ago that we don't know and we haven't seen enough of a development of? I feel like if you would have, as corny as it would be, if you wanted to do that roundabout, turn the world, change back time thing, I would have waited a couple movies so you really got that emotional depth between Superman and Lois Lane. So when she dies and he's got her in the arms in that moment there and all that, the emotion is felt enough that while it's goofy, he goes back in time, you could still make it at least make some kind of storytelling sense. Whereas I feel like in this movie, when it just happens, it makes it seem goofy and it makes it feel real forced from a character perspective because you haven't quite gotten that level of emotional connection between Lois Lane and Superman that would make something as drastically massive as let me turn the whole time back.
Yeah, I know. Sense. I saw your underwear.
Yeah.
I dropped you out of the sky, and now I love you enough to try to murder everyone on the planet to save you.
Right.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
And that's why I think it could be improved a bit. Is I'm like, it could there's some stuff there that I think could make that ending still goofy, but make a bit of sense. If they'd waited till Superman 2, like Charles has said, it would still be goofy and cheesy, but I would have had time to really believe Lois Lane and Superman's relationship development, and it would probably answer a couple of the questions that Chalon had mentioned earlier about why is this person, why this, it would have probably answered a lot of those questions in that 2 movie time. So when it happens, it's still goofy, but emotionally, cathartically, it makes more sense for the turn back time to happen because somebody would go that length for that person that I've developed a relationship for 2 movies over. Like I've spent, as an audience member, I've spent 3-4 hours watching these two together. So now, when that happens, heck yeah, it makes sense why he wants to possibly kill everyone on accident.
Possibly on accident. I agree. There was a lot of things that I would have changed. If I had to change one thing, though, in lieu of making the tone of the movie match the goofiness and childlikeness that we were going for, giving a little bit more reasoning and less awkwardness between suddenly Superman and Lois are just madly in love for no apparent reason. Because I loved the development of Lois's character in her first two scenes. I loved how humorous it was, that like she was so smart. She was way ahead of everyone else, and yet she couldn't spell, and she was relying on someone to help her spell. And then, she's madly in love with Superman and thinks that she can marry him. And I asked my husband, I was like, can you spell delusional?
Apparently not.
But these kinds of things, like, yeah, as Brian was saying, make it make more sense.
Earn it is my big thing on that. Make it make sense and earn your emotions in that story, which I think that movie earns a lot of emotions, but I don't think it earns that ending and that bit there. I don't think it earns all.
I think if I was to change anything, keeping in mind that Superman 2 is my favorite of the Superman movies, I would change the story of the Superman 2 movie, and I would change it because I would make Superman have not one. I would have gotten rid of the whole flying back in time thing, and Lois wouldn't have died. That would have already
a consensus from everyone.
Right? Yes, that would have already happened. But in the grand scheme of things, I would make that Superman chose to go save Lois first, and Miss Tessmacher's mother died, and therefore making her the actual villain for the second movie, with the complete purpose of destroying Superman and Lois Lane. For that whole reason, that is what I would change, and I would think that I don't know. I would love to see that film, and then I would bring Zod and the rest of them in the third movie.
Scream 2, all right.
Yeah, so that's what I would have done to make the movie change the story. So, WB. Anyway, listen. All that being
Warner
said,
Brothers, Mr. Gunn, I am here. I will make a brilliant New Gods film. If anyone out there is watching, I will treat Jack Kirby's creation with respect, and I'll do it.
I'm still waiting. I'm not waiting for the call because it's but I am
James,
going to
James, call me now immediately.
Listen to this episode of
My number is
Talk Stories. But I am dying to make my own. I am dying to be the one to bring Green Arrow into the DC universe.
Make him hum his own
cinematic universe,
like the TV show.
Yeah, and I am so I have such a great idea about that I anyway.
You'll have to pitch it to me. I haven't heard this.
I'll pitch it to you. But anyway, all that being said, that is all for our episode today. So I want to go around and get everybody's recommendations, what everybody recommends. I think what we are going to talk about next episode is probably not going to be Superman 2, but I'm kind of thinking we should talk about Jurassic Park. Kind of feeling like we should talk about that.
If you need someone to come on, I could talk about Jurassic Park. I was about to say, I could talk about that movie endlessly and the score to that movie.
That's probably
that's
the film
what
I've
I'm
seen
thinking.
the most times ever.
We will have definitive answers by the end of the week, but that's what I'm thinking we might talk about next week. I don't know if Jaylon, have you seen Jurassic Park? Okay, so
one of us.
100% watch that one.
It's either gonna be that or it's got to be The Lion King.
I would talk about
the animated Lion King, not the other one.
Let's not mention its name. I don't have a wastebasket near me.
But yeah, that's it. So recommendations, guys. Go around the rooms and let me know what you're recommending for our audience and for me to watch. Yes, I threw myself in there this week.
I can't beat your Legend of Vox Machina recommendation, though. You've put the bar too high. I can't meet it.
What about you, Charles? What do you got for the audience?
First off, I have two sneaky ones. Stick with me here.
Okay.
One, I highly recommend My Adventures with Superman. Jaylon, I think you would love that. That That is one of the best Superman things ever.
I second that sentiment.
Adorable. It's brilliant. It's a great adaptation without getting into
Jack Quaid is a fun Superman.
Yeah, that the show does everything I wanted Man of Steel to do back in the day, but didn't. It's a brilliant adaptation. It's fun. It's romantic and cute as all hell. It's very funny. Highly recommend that for you. If you're ever if this was not the thing that floated your boat, I think that one generally will float your boat. So that is that. But my official recommendation, because and this will be old news then, that David Lynch died. So in honor of David Lynch, no, it's not a show or a movie. And actually, it's not. David Lynch didn't actually work on this. This is actually Mark Frost. I recommend The Secret History of Twin Peaks. This is basically a book between seasons 2 and 3 that was written by the co-creator of Twin Peaks. This is filled with massive spoilers, so you had to watch the first 2 seasons and the movie before you watch this. But here's why I recommend it. Okay? This is now I can talk about Twin Peaks all the live long day. That's one of my favorite things in like the whole world. But the reason I bring up this book is that it's kind of like a pseudo history book. So it takes real history and applies it to Mark Frost and David Lynch's fictional world of Twin Peaks. But in the book is a fascinating history of UFOs and UFO history, Project Blue Book and Truman and why we call it flying saucers. There's history bits of the Washington area with Native nations and Lois and Clark, all that stuff. And I bring that up to say that if you're going to write anything, you have to know what the actual world is. This is not new information. This is a great example of if Mark Frost hadn't done the research on this, you never would have been able to have this book. And when you read other stuff, you get a bunch of different ideas. So with this book, you can read this on aliens or something, and you might make up like, I don't know, like a great kids mystery story out of just reading the history of like UFO stuff. This is certainly not the definitive take on that, but it's where I really started to fall for this subject because it just was fascinating reading this. So that's why I recommend this. I think this is a pretty solid. You can find probably better books, but this is the one that I have on the subject, and this is what made me go, "Wow, what a brilliant subject!" So I started watching like the YouTube channel bedtime stories about weird things like that. And just one more shout out to David Lynch because I'm still processing that. You know, and those are my 2 sneaky recommendations for this week. Oh, and Brian, if you don't know, I always recommend Battlestar Galactica. Now, this is from the 70s version. I'm talking about the 2000s version. That's my baby, but I always try to recommend Battlestar Galactica. That's not my official recommendation. I just wanted to tell Brian that's what I do from time to time. I've been getting better.
Yes. Because it's been popping up in a few things this week, in this conversation and in our conversation when I was looking up some references for the beautiful tribute that Charles wrote for David Lynch. There are so many gold nuggets within the behind the scenes footages and interviews of films that are made. And so I highly recommend that if you have a favorite film or you have a favorite filmmaker, you watch it behind the scenes, YouTube it or whatever, or find a DVD with a director's commentary, because it is fascinating and it will change your perspective and give you a much deeper perspective because you'll understand the time that the piece was made in.
100%.
Yeah.
Like, what about you, Brian? What's your recommendation?
I could throw a bunch of Jurassic Park facts at you. Just did you know when they were shooting the T-Rex, it would start to shiver because it would get wet? You know, like a little. I literally just watched this movie yesterday, guys, because I am.
But recommendation-wise, I'd have to go with a little underrated show that they finally put on Netflix that I feel like I really want people to watch. They've put the first season on Netflix. It's called Pantheon.
I enjoyed that. That was good.
The second season is not available to watch on Netflix. It is available. You'll have to watch it illegally because of some background behind the scenes shenanigans where it's only available in New Zealand and Australia, even though it was made because they canceled it on AMC Plus, the original people it came on when they'd already finished season 2, but they never finished the rights or sold off the rights. So it's basically in limbo, but it's a finished show with 2 seasons. And it is a very interesting, fascinating exploration of, rather than going with AI, it approaches the topic of UI and uploaded intelligence. Like, what happens if you upload a person you know and love into a computer? Are they still the person you know and love? What changes, especially, and then what happens when you put people who have ill intent in, basically make them digital gods? Like, they could have control of networks, they could have control of things. So what happens exploring that? And it explores that in 2 seasons, and it's a very fascinating. It's not a hopeless series, because there is a bit of hope in some bits, and there's a really good relationship between the main female protagonist and her father that's excellent. But I think it's hard sci-fi, like TV at its best. And I'm a huge fan of watching animated things that approach the medium of animation with some respect, rather than just, some kind of, I think you can do great kids animated shows, but I think animation for adults is hardly, for too long, it was just Family Guy knockoffs. So watching shows like Pantheon or Arcane or the Spider-Verse take it very maturely makes me happy, because I've always been a fan of like the Ghibli movies.
Ghibli, my dear, Ghibli.
Ghibli, whatever. The point being, I'm a huge fan of those movies and a lot of how they take animation and take it seriously. So point being point, watch Pantheon, especially if you like hard sci-fi. Very good story, interesting concepts, good voice acting, pretty solid animation. It's worth a watch.
Gotcha. For me, I have no recommendations for you guys this week. I will tell you what you should not watch if you haven't already seen it. I feel sorry for you, and I know that I'm going to be thrashed for saying this, but the movie Wicked, I hated every fucking bit of it, and every minute of it was horrible for me.
And fangirls screamed in abject.
I know, and everybody just said, "We're done with this podcast." No,
I really hope whoever's listening to this is not a Wicked fan.
I fell asleep at the last 30 minutes of it because my body just gave up on it. My mind engaged with it. I was like, okay, I will try. My wife sang every single song loudly, and I was like, this is.
The best part is she sang it loudly and you still couldn't stay awake.
And I was just like, I can't do it. I can't do it. This is not to put down anybody who's enjoyed it. If you enjoyed the film, if you loved it, if you thought it was a good movie, that's great. It wasn't for me.
Well, I think in honor of that, we should all hold space for the lyrics of Defying Gravity.
I think
Come on, guys.
We should all embrace gravity and stay on the ground as much as we can.
That note, y'all. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you for having me on, guys, and good to meet you all.
Yes, we will definitely have you back. We will definitely have you back. I'll let Charles know when we're doing the Superman 3 or 4. 4 is probably the best one. We can talk about Quest for Peace, because I think that is arguably, I think everybody here will agree probably that is probably the worst Superman movie ever.
Undeniable fact.
It is terrible.
Also, if you need somebody for Jurassic Park.
Yes. Keep that in mind as well. Other than that, guys, starting next week, we are probably going to do a new method on talking about some of this stuff, but I'll surprise you guys that will be here next week, and you'll just see it when I roll it out. For the rest of you guys, check us out on our Substack, www.obaconnect.com, and our social medias, One Brilliant Arc on every one of our social media platforms. And yeah, we did have cool memes, but now we only get them when Charles rolls them out. We had cool ones before, but they banned CapCut. No, he's doing great. They banned CapCut, so now I can't do the cool video movie clip memes that I was doing. But anyway, that's besides the point. Enjoy the rest of your week. You will be as surprised as the rest of us as to whatever the film or movie or whatever it is that we end up watching next week to talk about. Anyway, thanks for listening, and keep on writing.
Yes.
Yep.